Actually, I thought the quarter breaks yesterday were a good idea.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think I'll do that, just because I know our secretaries, they need a break as well. So, I will do that probably before we get to the two heavier ones.
And you
So
are
I
live
think-
now, Senator Carson.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Tricia, really appreciate it.
No problem.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Senator Sharon Carson from District 14. Today, we will be holding a meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Before we get started, I will read through a checklist to ensure that the meeting that we are holding is in compliance with the right to know law. As chair of the Judiciary Committee, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by the governor as the result of the COVID-19 pandemic and in accordance with the governor's emergency order number 12 pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04 and its extensions, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting, which was authorized pursuant to the governor's emergency order. In accordance with the emergency order, I am confirming that 1, we are providing public access to the meeting by telephone with additional access possible by video and other electronic means. We are utilizing Zoom for this electronic meeting. All members of the committee and selective legislative staff have the ability to communicate contemporaneously in this meeting through this platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously watch and or listen to the meeting on Zoom or YouTube and via phone by following the directions and links provided on the general court website. 2, we have provided public notice of the necessary information for accessing the meeting in the Senate calendar. 3, we are providing a mechanism for the public to alert the public body during the meeting if there are problems with access. If anyone has a problem, please email remotesenate@leg.state.nh.us or call 603-271-6931. In the event the public is unable to access the meeting will be adjourned and rescheduled. 5, please note that all votes taken during this meeting shall be done by roll call vote. And 6, finally, let's start the meeting by taking roll call attendance. When each member states their presence, please also state where they are and if anyone else is in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the right to know law. I will call the roll. Senator French.
What? Oh. Harold French, Senator
Oh,
District
goodness.
7. Broadcasting live once again from Concord, New Hampshire. No one else is in the room?
Okay, thank you. Senator Gannon.
I am in sunny Sandown on the shores of Lake Phillip, in, again, Sandown, the heart of New Hampshire wine country, alone in my home office.
Thank you. Senator Whitley.
Good afternoon. This is Senator Becky Whitley. I'm at my home in Hopkinton. I'm alone in the room, but my husband is in the house.
Thank you. Senator Khan.
At home in Keene, my wife is no longer in, but she will be back soon.
Thank you. And Senator Carson, I am at my home in Londonderry and my daughters are in the room with me. Okay, we are going to start the day by opening the public hearing on House Bill 539 and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Yokela.
Thank you, Senator Carson and members of the Judiciary Committee. I am Representative Josh Yokela from Fremont, Danville, and Brentwood, and I am introducing today my bill, HB 539, which seeks to set up, kind of roll back the requirements or the allowance which went into effect in 2001, which allowed the AG's office to get records of communication common carriers without a search warrant. And so since 2018, we've had this this constitutional amendment that says that the government should not get into our, we should be free from governmental intrusion and private and personal information. So instead of just setting up a demand from the Attorney General based on a belief that some of the services provided by communication carrier might have been used for an unlawful purpose, just say that they have to get a search warrant like everyone else. And as a part of this research, I asked the AG's office for all the times that they have requested this information since the constitutional amendment passed in 2018. And I received about 48, 49 requests from them. And all of those requests, except for one, were the information was sent to local police departments, not the AG, the DOJ. So it is mostly being used by requests from local police departments to get this information and getting sent back. And so it's not even being mostly used by AG's office. One request did go to the department, the DOJ in that time period. And so these common carriers range from anyone from Facebook to your ISP to your phone company. And so all I'm seeking to do is say, if you can't use the AG's office to get around the search warrant requirements, you just get a search warrant. And so that's what this bill is seeking to do today. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
You're on mute, Senator.
The dogs had barked. Thank you for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator French?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Representative. Do you have the bill in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Line 11,
I didn't.
page 1.
Okay. I'm not sure. I didn't pull up the one with the line numbers, but what's the?
So just grammar, it says, but it not limited to, should it be, but is not limited to?
Is not. But it
That's a
is
great-
not limited to. Yeah.
Should be, it
It.
should be is limited, is not limited to. So it's a grammatical error.
I know, I was just
Thank you.
bringing it up. Okay.
Okay. Are there any further questions?
Changes.
Senator Khan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative, thanks for providing your insights into the bill. The steps that the information provides, beginning on line 12, after the is limited, is not limited to. There's no contents of the messages being shared. There's information about contacts. And so what is the next step that you anticipate occurs after these administrative orders are issued?
The next step after they receive the information from the common carriers, is that what your question is?
Yes.
Okay. So first, right now, these common carriers are required to give the information. There's no judicial option for them to say, hey, this is not appropriate for whatever reason. And those things are not limited to the things listed on that list. So there is anywhere in this bill, it does not say that they couldn't ask for any other type of information that the person has or that the agency has. And the next step, I would for the law enforcement agency, once they get the information, would be to investigate that information and see if a crime was actually committed.
I guess what I was searching for, if I might follow up, Madam Chair,
Yes, please.
is that after the administrative warrant is provided, is there a judicial warrant that is necessary to gather the follow-up information that provides the contents be released?
So the contents of the person's calls and stuff like that, if you were getting a search warrant, you would need to provide that to the actual person, the subscriber, and get the information, let's say, from their phone, and get their call history, et cetera, et cetera. So, or if a computer, you would get the websites that they visited, the cookies and anything that they downloaded or whatever. So yes, you could do a search warrant with based off of this information to search the person's residence, let's say, or place of business. But that would be, you would be searching two different things. One of them is your records, and one of them is a specific location. And maybe you'd be looking for different things based on the information that you have at that time. So thank you for the question.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Are there any further questions for Representative Yokela? Representative, I have two questions. You had talked about the fact that the local police were the ones that were accessing this information. Do you know if they had to go through a process through the AG's office in order to get that information?
So thank you for the question. I don't know of the process. They when I was asking for the information about the subpoenas that they were issued, the AG's office asked me if I needed kind of like the backup for what information they were provided to issue the subpoenas, and I thought that was not necessary. So I don't know exactly what was provided to the AG's office to request that the information be requested from the AG's office. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. And secondly, in the bill, and I'm looking at the language that has been crossed out, but it is existing language. It on page 2, beginning on line 4, it says the Attorney General shall adopt rules pursuant to 541A relative to, and do you know if that process was completed?
Thank you for the question. I don't know exactly what rules were created. However, I did ask for the records that were kept based on this law, and so those records were provided via a right to know request. So they are in compliance as far as I know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any further questions for Representative Yokela? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Representative. Next, we're going to move to Brent Scora.
Yes, can you hear me, Senator?
We sure can.
Great. So I've got some prepared testimony. So Chair Carson, Vice Chair Gannon, members committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Brent Skorup. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. My research focuses on telecom and tech law. Tech and telecom companies today collect a large amount of private and personal data, including location, home address, medical information, and financial information. So it's welcome news that you're assessing the state of new tech, privacy, and constitutional law. I offer the following 2 recommendations for the committee's consideration. You should consider bringing clarity, 1, to the warrantless collection of phone and internet records, and 2, to the warrantless purchase of consumer data by state law enforcement. 1, bringing clarity to the collection of phone and internet records. Given the popularity of 5G and Wi-Fi technologies, tech and telecom companies have much denser installations of their equipment, which means they have pretty precise location of users' phones. In 2018, the US Supreme Court in Carpenter held that when law enforcement collect cell phone data of a single suspect over multiple days, that amounts to a search and police need a warrant. However, the court did not expressly apply the decision to law enforcement acquiring tower dumps, which is when the location of all users of a certain cell tower are acquired by police via subpoena, which can be hundreds or sometimes thousands of subscribers. New Hampshire may wish to expressly add phone geolocation data, including tower dumps, to examples of protected information to provide more protection to residents. Furthermore, the current New Hampshire DOJ law enforcement manual interprets the law, interprets common carriers to mean that law enforcement can acquire not only phone records, but also internet records without a warrant. Lawmakers may wish to expressly include internet records as an example of protected data and to protect privacy rights. Second, I hope you'll clarify whether warrantless purchases of consumer data by law enforcement is permitted. This is a new issue. According to recent news reports, some federal law enforcement agencies collect residents' information by purchasing it from commercial data collection companies. While I'm not aware of phone internet companies selling such information to New Hampshire law enforcement, these news reports suggest that it's an increasing tool of law enforcement to acquire commercial data. As written, current New Hampshire law doesn't protect against acquisition of consumer data because that data is acquired via an exception to the warrant requirement, the third-party doctrine. To protect privacy rights, New Hampshire may consider requiring a search warrant or other safeguards and protocols before law enforcement can use or purchase commercial data from phone and internet companies. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about this important legislation. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Scorup. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Margaret, that was the last person that I had to sign up to speak. Are there folks in the waiting room who would like to speak?
Yes, I have 2 hands raised.
Okay, let's take the first one.
All right. Hi, am I being heard here?
Yes, you are.
Okay, hi, my name is Amy Pikoff, and I am a policy officer for the social media network Parler, as well as I had been the founder of the Center for the Legalization of Privacy, and I came and worked a little bit with Mr. Yokela on a proposed constitutional amendment last year. Before the pandemic, I actually came to New Hampshire and testified in person. And the only thing that I wanted to add today is that the existing law, which allows government agencies to obtain information without a warrant, is premised on the third-party doctrine, which the man who just gave you testimony was alluding to briefly. The third-party doctrine, as you might be aware, allows the government to obtain information without a warrant on the premise that it had already been shared with this third party. And so therefore you didn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in it. But as I've talked about in previous testimony, the third party doctrine came about in the context of so-called secret agent cases, in which you had a criminal organization and there was a government agent who had penetrated that criminal organization and was getting information shared with them in the context of that criminal activity. It's what the common law calls a so-called illegal contract. Now, it was only in the 1970s that the so-called third-party doctrine was transported into the context of ordinary business contracts like we all have with our phone companies, our banks, internet service providers, social media companies, et cetera. These are all legal contracts. These are not illegal contracts as were the contracts in which the case in the third-party doctrine that arose. And so all that Josh Yokela is doing here in this case is bringing the law back where it should have been. The third-party doctrine really never needed to come about. You could have used the common law and said that the contracts in which information were being shared were actually illegal contracts. They were criminal situations. All of us, you and I, when we make contracts with our telephone companies, internet service providers, et cetera, we are not criminals. We are not engaged in any sort of criminal enterprise. And so the promises that are made with respect to keeping that information private, those should be respected. And it should require a warrant based on probable cause and particularized suspicion for anybody to induce the violation of that contract, to induce the sharing of that information. And this was recognized in small part in Carpenter versus United States in 2018, but the trend, as we're seeing in other states across the country, is to recognize that the third-party doctrine actually should not apply to information shared in these contexts, that in essence, everybody should be getting a warrant. You should not be having to give up a reasonable expectation of privacy in your data simply because you're going about your daily life and sharing information with service providers. So I am grateful that Representative Yokela is introducing this and helping New Hampshire be at the forefront of recognizing this longstanding error in the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Margaret, can we put the next person through?
Yes, Ellen Scarponi.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Senator Carson and committee. My name is Ellen Scarponi, and I am testifying on behalf of Consolidated Communications. I had only signed in opposition because our position is that our experience is that the current process has and continues to work. And I just wanted, I'm speaking because I'm a little confused about how this is being taken to be a more comprehensive Privacy Act than what this is intended to do. Common carriers such as Consolidated Communications have to adhere to the CP&I, the Customer Proprietary Network Information Regulations at the FCC, and cannot divulge information about our customers. And this statute that is being cited here, the original language says that the only thing that would be furnished to the AG are the names and addresses of persons to whom stated, listed, or unlisted telephone numbers are assigned, names and addresses of any local and long distance billing records, the length of service, the types of service, the telephone number, but there is nowhere in there that it talks about any content or anything further than that. The recommended language here is but is not limited to, but it is very definitely limited to those things. So I just wanted to raise that observation, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Scarponi. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Khan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's nobody signed up that I saw from the Attorney General's office or county attorneys. So I'm wanting to ask somebody, what is lost with the passage of this bill? What can you venture an answer to that?
Thank you for your question, Senator Khan. I really can't venture an answer to that question.
Okay.
The other thing that has come up in conversations with other common carriers that I've talked to are that a search warrant may be defined in law, but we haven't seen where a judicially recognized exception to the warrant requirement is defined. And we as common carriers will, or on behalf of my common carrier, will adhere to whatever the law is, but we don't know what that is, and that it, concerned that it would be put into law without a definition.
May I follow?
Yes, follow up.
So thanks again for taking another question here, but you do understand what an administrative warrant is, right? When it's
Yes.
issued? Yes. Okay. And okay, that just wanted to establish we have a common understanding of our current practice.
Certainly, and search warrants, no question, but the judicially recognized exception was a concern.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Scarponi? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Margaret, is that the last person?
That is, there are no other hands raised.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing on House Bill 539. Next, I'm going to open the public hearing on House Bill 566 and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Yokella.
Thank you, Senator Carson and members of the committee. My bill HB 566 is relative to the disclosure of non-public session minutes. And the issue at hand is that meeting minutes there's a specific reasons while you're allowed to go into non-public session, and then there are specific reasons for which you're able to keep those meeting minutes private, away from the public's eye. However, those meeting minutes are not always gone back to later when those circumstances for which they are kept from the public eye are no longer applicable. And so this bill seeks to encourage people to go back and be able to discuss the meeting minutes that were kept from the public in the right to know law. And it says it adds the consideration of disclosure of non-public session minutes to the reasons to go into non-public, so that you can decide whether or not you can release these minutes. And then also it seeks to allow for meeting minutes related to the discussion of sale, lease, or purchase of property to be able to be automatically disclosed after the close of that sale, under the logic that the reason to keep them from the public is so that the state isn't put at a disadvantage when it's trying to negotiate or think about whether or not it's going to make an offer or accept an offer. And so for those reasons, once the sale is either fallen through or has been completed, there's no reason to keep those minutes from the public any longer. And so this bill will automatically release those meeting minutes so that people will be able to find out what was said and hold those elected officials accountable when the time comes for re-election, et cetera. So that's the general gist of this bill, and I hope you'll support it. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Representative. Are there any questions for Representative Yokella? Senator Khan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Representative, for taking this question. But would you believe that I've experienced instances where the public body would, in non-public session, receive authorization to offer up to a particular price on a property, and then be able to negotiate a number that was somewhat less than that, and that disclosure of the difference might jeopardize a sale or embarrass a public, a private citizen. Would you believe?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And that is exactly the reason for, so I'm not sure how it would embarrass a private citizen. However, the keeping of the negotiation secret during the negotiation process exactly a reason why it is allowed to be kept from the public. However, once the sale has been closed, there's no legitimate reason for, because there's a counterbalance of openness of government and the public's right to know. And during the negotiation process, there's a strong, arguably a strong reason for keeping that information private, so that the negotiations can happen in good faith and that the government is not put at a disadvantage towards other people who might also be bidding or trying to contract that service. But however, after the deal is done, then the legislative body should know what is being done in their name so that they can take appropriate action. And so I do believe that there are some sensitive issues there, and for a time that those meeting minutes might very well be kept private. So thank you for the question.
Are there any further questions for Representative Yokela? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to go to Natch Grays.
Thank you, Senator Carson. This is Nate Grays with the New Hampshire Municipal Association. We do support HB 566, and there are really two things this bill does. The first is that it clarifies that the discussion of previously sealed minutes can occur in non-public session. This has been something that hasn't been 100% clear before, and we do support this clarification because it ensures that public bodies can go back and discuss sealed minutes, and when they may need to discuss the substance, they may not need to discuss the substance depending on exactly why those were sealed, and determine whether it's appropriate to release those at that time. The second thing this bill does is it changes the sealing period for real estate transactions. And so as Senator Khan indicated, there's certainly cases where the real estate transaction would need to have its minutes sealed and remain sealed for the duration of the transaction. And we certainly support that, and that's currently the law. But as Representative Yokela stated, there's really no reason for those minutes to remain sealed, assuming it's an ordinary transaction and there's not some sort of embarrassment playing in here. But an ordinary transaction where you're buying some land for the new town hall or something like that, there's no real reason to keep them sealed after that transaction closes. And in fact, the law states now that the minutes can only remain sealed for as long as there's a reason to keep them sealed. This just makes it a little bit easier on boards, so they don't have to go back and vote to unseal those. That would just automatically unseal them at that appropriate time. I imagine if there is a situation where there is some sort of embarrassment or other factor in there, the board could go back and vote to keep those sealed if necessary.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Grace. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Margaret, this is all I have for folks who've signed up to testify. Are there folks in the waiting room?
If anybody else wishes to testify, you can virtually raise your hand. We do not have any hands raised.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing on House Bill 566. Okay, I think we are behind, and I think we can move forward with the next bill, which is House Bill 232, and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Ho.
Representative, you could virtually raise, oh, here we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Chair. Just to help you out, my last name's pronounced Huff.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, members of
no.
the committee. In keeping with time constraints here, I'm sure you guys are under the gun with all that you have to do. I'll try to be as brief as possible. The bill HB 232 relative to non-public session of the right to know law is its genesis comes from an incident that happened in my hometown that was brought to light actually during my campaign. And that was that our city council, along with its city manager, purchased a property in town for $1.2 million, and nobody in the town knew anything about it until it was a signed, sealed delivery, done deal. And the only reason it was discovered was that somebody actually had seen it in the registry of deeds. Now, the reason I wanted to just start with that is because when this came about, the problem is that the city council mentioned that the reason that they were able to do such a thing, they directly quoted RSA 91A. So I looked at it and discovered what they were talking about was in 91A3, section D, which states the consideration and acquisition, sale or lease of real or personal property, which if discussed in public would likely benefit a party or parties whose interests are adverse to those in the general community. Now, what the problem was, and it took me a long time to try and figure what the issue was. In 91A, if you go through the entire statute, I believe the word consideration is used 9 times. In those 9 times, 8 of them are consistent with the typical use of the word, to consider, to debate, to discuss, to contemplate. This particular piece in D is an entirely different meaning. And that's where the yank came. Consideration when it comes to real estate is money. It's payment. So when they were using this, they were conflating the two meanings of the word. So what my bill basically does is it doesn't allow for them to go behind closed doors anymore and discuss the idea of purchasing a property. They have to let the public know what they're doing with the public's money, or what their intent is. For example, if they were to have done it differently, they would have said, we're going to have a hearing, or we're interested in purchasing a property for whatever, and this is what we think. What it still allows is the nuts and bolts of the idea of the non-public session. It still allows for them to get behind closed doors and discuss price, availability, all of the meat and potatoes of a real estate transaction. So that is still protected by the fiduciary responsibility that they have. And that's basically the essence of it. I do want to add, just read this very quickly, because I think it's very germane to the whole purpose of this. And that is let me just find it quickly here. That is the preamble to RSA 91A. It says openness in the conduct of public business is essential to a democratic society. The purpose of this chapter is to ensure both the greatest possible public access to the actions, discussions, and records of all public bodies and their accountability to the people. That's a big important part of this. That's why I brought it up. It also is constitutionally in line with Article 8. And I will leave it there. And if there's any questions from the committee, I'd be willing to answer anything I can.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative Huff. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we'll call Natch Grays.
Thank you, Senator Carson. This is Nate Graves from the New Hampshire Municipal Association again. We oppose this bill. While we think it has good intentions, we think that it creates a hole in that real estate transaction provision of the non-public session statute. So currently, that statute allows the board to enter non-public session for the purpose of the consideration of the acquisition, sale, or lease of real personal property or personal property, which, if discussed in public, would likely benefit a party or parties whose interests are adverse to those of the general community. So, in other words, if I'm on a board, we could enter non-public session to discuss the possibility of buying $1 million piece of property, or I should say a piece of property for the new town hall. We could discuss the amount that we're willing to pay up to and authorize someone to go negotiate for us who'd report back, and we determine whether to take that offer or not. Obviously, if we tell everyone in town we're willing to pay up to $1 million, suddenly all the parcels and property are going to be listed at $1 million if the town is going to be the bidder. So that certainly isn't a good use of public money. The problem with HB 232 as written is it changes the language to say the consideration of the amount paid, offered, or accepted is what's to be done in non-public session. So it wouldn't include that discussion of the amount that we, the board, are willing to pay, or in the opposite instance, that we want to sell the property for in the absence of an actual offer. So we'd be forced to disclose what might be considered as a minimum or maximum price. And so anyone paying attention to what we're doing as a board would know, what the most is that we're willing to pay or the lowest we're willing to sell a property for, which really defeats the ability of the market to value the property and the ability of us to negotiate a fair price for it. So we think that would basically end up defeating the purpose of the exemption, and there would be no reason to go into non-public session at that point in time, because what we're trying to keep secret, kind of the nuts and bolts of that negotiation process, would no longer be exempt, and so there would be no reason to enter non-public session. And for that reason, we oppose this bill.
Hey, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Margaret, that was the last speaker I had signed up. Is there anyone in the waiting room?
Representative Hoff has his hand up again.
Okay, let's go back to Representative Huff.
Representative, you should be able to unmute.
Sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. If it pleases the chair, I just want to clarify something that the last speaker said. And that is, it does not preclude them from doing the nuts and bolts in closed session. That is exactly not what this bill says. The reality is, I've heard this argument before about the idea of, if it is known that something is for sale, that somebody else could jack the price up. I was a real estate broker. The reality is that anybody can make an offer on anything at any time. And if they do, it's up to the buyer and the seller to agree to it. So if, for example, a city wants to buy a piece of property, they make their offer. They can discuss their offer behind closed doors. They can make their offer behind closed doors. It's a fiduciary responsibility. It's up to that seller whether or not they accept it or not. And anybody else who wanted to make an offer, they're free to do so. What they can't do, and it doesn't work this way, is make an outlandish offer to try and jack the price up. Because if their offer isn't submitted properly in writing with consideration, it's not a valid offer. So I just wanted to just clear that, because I've heard that argument before and it's somewhat disingenuous. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'd be willing to take them.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Senator French has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative. Just explain to me, because I haven't looked it up, access to governmental records and meetings, and this covers non-public sessions, correct?
Correct.
Oh, when permitted, this allows the boards to discuss the amount they're willing to pay, the amount they're going to be offering in private session, not in public, correct?
That is correct.
So the last speaker said that would be done publicly. He was wrong, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Senator.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions for Representative Huff? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Representative. Margaret, has anyone else raised their hand?
We have no more hands raised.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing on House Bill 232. Jenny, how are we on time? Can we move to the next bill?
Go on to the next one, Senator.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and open the public hearing on House Bill 236 and recognize prime sponsor, Representative Vale.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'm Representative Suzanne Vale, representing Hillsborough County District 30, which is Nashua Ward 3. I'm here before you to ask for your consideration of House Bill 236 and to request that the committee move ought to pass on this bill and send a positive recommendation to the Senate floor. House Bill 236 is an act creating a statute of limitation on civil actions relative to damage caused by perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl compounds known as PFAS chemicals. This piece of legislation is part of an effort to develop a system of response to the PFAS contamination of New Hampshire land, water, and inhabitants. For those who are not aware of the effects of PFAS on health of ecosystems and inhabitants, PFAS chemicals are groups of thousands of compounds that are bioaccumulative and they are environmentally persistent. They are in manufacturing to repel water and oil by an industry that makes nonstick such as Teflon, waterproof fabrics such as Gore-Tex, and also includes creation of firefighting gear and firefighting foam. These compounds are present in carpeting, food packaging, many other products that require liquid to be repelled. Because of the slippery nature of the tiny particles in PFAS groups of compounds, they easily enter the soil and enter the groundwater. They do not dissolve. They are called forever chemicals. The town abutting my district in Nashua has within it a zone of contamination within which private municipal wells have been rendered unusable due to the PFAS contamination. This zone of contamination is presently a 4.5 mile radius around the St. Gobain Performance Plastic Plant on Dan Webster Highway in Merrimack. People who live within that contamination zone in Merrimack must implement high-level filtration systems on their homes or obtain an alternative water supply. St. Gobain Performance Plastics has been providing bottled water to many residents since the contamination was revealed to them in 2017. The contamination involves Litchfield, Londonderry, Amherst, and other towns across the state of New Hampshire. The secondary issue is the recycling of these bottles, and right now I believe that falls on Merrimack to cover the recycling. There are other sources of PFAS contamination in other areas in New Hampshire. Contamination in Amherst, New Hampshire was caused by a different manufacturer using chemicals in another kind of process. The Coakley landfill, which is to our east, is also a Superfund project, is leaching PFAS chemicals, and there's a large concern about the cluster of cancers in that area. In longitudinal studies, evidence implicates that PFAS affects fetal development. It increases risk of developmental and endocrine disorders where hormone suppression occurs. PFAS is linked to cancer, kidney disease, high cholesterol, and tumors, particularly in small animals. It also concentrates in breast milk, affecting the mother's ability to nurse her child. Cities, towns, and taxpayers are being stuck with the remediation tab and have significant damages and health complications with nowhere to turn. Polluters have sought permission to keep polluting without filtration installed that is intended to mitigate releases of PFAS compounds into the air. The longer filtration is delayed, the more people are exposed over a longer period of time. Polluters have not provided information to residents about the impact of the manufacturing on their drinking water, and they have not established a cleanup plan. They have somehow been able to manipulate and dominate the EPA for varying lengths of time over many decades at the national level, and this involves big companies, multi-billion-dollar multinational companies, and it allows the manufacturing and creation of PFAS to continue with no end in sight. Why expand the statute of limitations? We need more time to calculate the scope of the harm that has been done to townspeople and to address impact on specific vulnerable groups, such as elderly, children, pregnant women, women who are nursing. This is particularly important because of the latency of the illness onset. We need to identify victims and get a sense of the scope of the problem in all of New Hampshire. We need to protect municipalities from bearing the cost and the health effects of industrial pollution. And we need to delineate a true zone of contamination defined by a perimeter of wells that are clear of the toxic levels of PFAS within the current allowable maximum contaminant levels that we're working with right now. We need to provide vital education to citizens and medical providers of this region. Before I close, I just want to say that the most compelling image in my mind and argument in support of this bill is when I consider the position that nation's firefighters are now in dealing with cancers, endocrine disorders, and untold further physical consequences due to PFAS exposure in the gear they wear and the firefighting foam. We have 1,115,000 firefighters in the United States. We have thousands of fire stations in America, hundreds in New Hampshire, and we have not begun to test, study, and make significant progress with remediation, except in New Hampshire at the former Pease Air Force Base. There is a long way to go before we know what is needed and who needs it. For that reason, we'd like to expand the statute of limitations for the PFAS injury to give more time for people to prove injury and to make that to 6 years at this time. Although it's hard to imagine any kind of statute of limitations when this is an ongoing problem. With that, I will take any questions that you may have, but I do impart that the following speaker may have or may be about to address the questions in their testimony. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my testimony.
Thank you, Representative Vale. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Khan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative, I believe I read the current statute of limitations. But just remind me, what is that?
3 years
3 years.
for personal injury.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions? Okay, Senator Gannon?
Just how do you arrive at 6 years?
That is a very good question. That is something that was discussed among a number of folks in Merrimack, and I was not present for that discussion, but
Okay.
it was just decided that the 3 years is not enough time, and I can't clearly answer what you just asked me.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to go to Representative Mooney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much, and members of the committee. My name is Maureen Mooney. I'm a state representative for the town of Merrimack in Hillsborough County, District Number 21. I'm a co-sponsor of House Bill 236, an act creating a statute of limitation on civil actions relative to damage caused by PFAS. I am in support of this bill. To give some background on my involvement with this bill, the late Speaker, Dick Hinch, asked that I work with him and the Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water on 2 legislative issues. And as a result, I am a co-sponsor of House Bill 236. The town of Merrimack is victim to possibly the worst case of environmental pollution in the state's history, with the discovery of PFAS contaminants discovered in drinking water tanks. The town has spent years reacting to this news and determining the effects on clean air, drinking water, groundwater, wastewater, and soil. This statute of limitations bill is a much needed measure to ensure a guideline for resident reaction to effects of PFAS. In 2005, I co-sponsored Senate Bill 75, which created the new section in law extending the statute of limitations in civil actions based upon a sexual assault case. An extended statute of limitations is critical for those suffering injury and now find themselves balancing their health and well-being along with the complications of legal recourse. 6 years after the date of discovery is sufficient, and the bill is written well to clearly provide that direction. The citizens of Merrimack ask for its passage. Please vote ought to pass on House Bill 236. Thank you for your service to New Hampshire. And that concludes my testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative Mooney. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay. Representative Mooney, Representative Vale had referenced a meeting that she said that she had not gone to, but that the committee, the community had concerning PFAS. And I know Merrimack the citizens of Merrimack has been very, very involved in this, but they believe that the current 3-year statute of limitation wasn't enough. Do you know anything about this meeting at all?
I wasn't present at that meeting. I believe it was likely a citizens group that meets with St. Gobain, and or it was a meeting of the Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water. Either way, Senator Carson, I believe that members of both of those groups will testify on this bill and may have some insight into that very question.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Representative Mooney? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to go to Alan Brooks.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I'm Alan Brooks from the Department of Justice. We take no position on this bill. I do want to make clear, though, that nothing I say is meant in any way to take away from what the sponsors are trying to achieve or to dilute the effectiveness of the language of the bill as it currently stands. I understand that these are big issues and they're difficult to deal with. My issue is simply that, as written, I'm concerned that the bill may inadvertently create a limitation on state actions, whereas currently there isn't. Right now, state plaintiffs are covered by a specific statute of limitation, which is 508:4-H. This was the result several years ago of discussions and compromise between various people, including myself. And it is meant to address not only putting a limitation on the state, but ensuring that we have the ability to go forward with cases specifically contamination. And that's why I was involved, longstanding contamination issues. The current bill that's proposed says civil actions. It says civil actions for PFAS shall have 6 years. And my concern is that term civil action is broad enough that a defendant could argue that that includes civil actions by the state. And we want to make sure that we retain all the tools in our toolbox to address PFAS going into the future. So my recommendation is to amend the bill, not to take away any of the effectiveness that it has and not to change what it is trying to do, but to make sure that we are not precluded from bringing any action. I had talked to the sponsors. They were nice enough to take the time to speak with me about possibly changing the word civil action to personal action. That would match what's in the existing statute of limitations. That's the 3-year statute. I don't believe they had a comfort level with making that change because they didn't want to inadvertently not do some type of action. And so my recommendation now would add a complete sentence at the end that says, nothing in this section shall be construed as limiting any action brought by the state.
Okay, if you can hold on for a second, please, Mr. Brooks. Jenny, could you make sure that you get that that language verbatim? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. You can please continue.
That's really all I had. Again, we do not want to undermine anything that the sponsors are trying to do. We spend a lot of our time now, both at DES and DOJ, dealing with these issues, and we want to make sure that we're effective going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Brooks. Senator French has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Brooks. So right now we've heard there's a 3-year statute of limitation for bringing actions for PFAS exposure. Is that true?
I believe they're referring to 508:4. It would depend on the specific action, but that's generally for what we call personal actions. It's 3 years.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be possible just to remove all statute of limitations regarding PFAS exposure if we decided to?
That's a policy decision for the legislature to make. It's one that you could make if you chose to. These limitations are created by statute and they can be taken away by statute.
That's what I thought. Thank you very much.
Okay, Senator Khan has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for providing Department of Justice reaction and just input into this hearing. I appreciate it. So I'm looking at 508:4H, and relative to the 3 years from the date when the plaintiff agency or department is made aware of possible exposure, and it refers to both personal action and civil enforcement. So I'm losing the distinction that you were trying to draw.
We actually thank you for your question, Senator. So we actually litigated this case before the enactment of 508:4H. It's called Lake Winnipesaukee Resort. And what happened was the defendant thought that we had taken too long to bring a case. Our statute limitations applied. We said it did not and went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looked at it and said, well, personal action, which is the term used in 508:4, that doesn't really look like the action the state is bringing because you're bringing a penalty action by statute. You're not bringing a normal tort claim or something that a normal person would. And so personal action, that really doesn't cover the state action. And so that's where the distinction arose. And I think the drafters, as we worked with them in 508:4H, wanted to make sure, and it was the intent of all of us, that it would apply not just to whatever traditionally was a personal action, but to any action that we might bring. And the case there was a penalty action for wetlands. So we wanted to make sure that we could not bring a civil action that was a penalty action for, let's say, a violation.
May I follow?
Follow up, please.
Thank you. So where you want this amendment to be on 485 as is proposed by the legislation, but does this need to extend to 508?
I don't believe so. The current 508 as written, we tried to address these issues, and you'll notice the last sentence, if you have it in front of you, says that it shall not apply to any situation where remediation has not yet occurred. I'm sorry, I don't have it verbatim in front of me, but that's the sentiment. And so the idea of that sentence was that so long as the contamination is still in the ground, you can fix it. So I don't think that we need additional latitude there, but we do want to make sure that a different bill doesn't take away something that we have.
Can I ask one more follow?
Yes, please. And then Senator Gannon.
Yes, thanks. So there was some reference made to the exposure that firefighters experience with exposure through the suits that they wear or the buildings that they enter. And can you recall what the statute of limitations is on the insurance or either the legal claim or the insurance claim that a firefighter can bring?
Again, thank you for the question. I'll make two responses, but neither might be satisfying. One is that I don't do that type of work very often, thankfully. So I don't know it off the top of my head. The other is I want to be very careful about, in a public meeting, saying that some limitation applies to someone else's action might harm them in some way, because now they say, well, DOJ said you don't have an action anymore. So I can't really give you much information. And if I could, I'd be hesitant to opine on that hypothetically.
Madam Chair, I'm glad Mr. Lehman has got his hand up, because I think that we've recently reviewed legislation like that, and my recall is not good enough to remember how we treated it.
Okay, so please, Mr. Lehman, if you'd like to chime in.
Senator, I think the statute of limitations for firefighters applies in the context of workers' compensation, and they can file a claim until they're 65 years old. And I'm pretty sure over in Commerce, you have a bill that extends it to 70.
That's what I was recalling. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any further questions, Senator Khan?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Senator Gannon?
Thank you. Mr. Brooks, under Winnipesaukee, did the court, or do you have another reason is there a limitation now for a state action?
The limitation now for state actions would be 508:4-H.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions for Mr. Brooks? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to go to Robert Healy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Mr. Healy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I am Representative Bob Healy of Merrimack, and I'm speaking as a co-sponsor in support of House Bill 236. Merrimack and the surrounding communities of Bedford, Litchfield, and Londonderry have been dealing with the PFAS contamination issues in the areas surrounding the St. Aubin Performance Plastics facilities since 2016. The contamination has been found in our air, soil, ground, and drinking water, and we have had to deal with private wells being deemed unusable and wells belonging to the Merrimack Village District being shut down for high PFAS contamination rates. While St. Aubin has agreed to pay for some of the cost incurred to filter this contaminated public wells, the public bottled water or connect private well owners to public water. This has been a long, laborious process for these affected people, and after 5 years, some of them are still receiving bottled water. As time has gone by, researchers are finding that the forever chemicals are causing more and more harm to people. They have found that potential adverse health impacts associated with PFAS exposure include liver damage, thyroid disease, decreased fertility, high cholesterol, hormone suppression, and even cancers. Also, these chemicals can pass through the placental barrier, thus passing to the unborn, and can be passed through breast milk to infants. As further study of maximum contaminant levels of these chemicals evolves, our citizens need additional time to identify the physical damage to their bodies and seek protections under the law. I speak today in favor of House Bill 236 to extend the statute of limitations to 6 years after the damage is discovered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative, and please accept my apology. I did not realize that you were a state representative. I thought you were someone representing the town of Merrimack as a selectman, so please apologize. I apologize for that.
There's no need to, oh, sorry, no need to apologize. My wife is actually a town councilor, so.
Maybe that's where I recognize the name.
Yep.
So thank you, Representative. Are there any questions for Representative Healy? Okay, Senator Khan has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I'm interested in Mr. Healy's Healy's answer to your question about how it was 6 years was arrived at.
The 6 years was arrived at when in some of the meetings they were talking about originally 3 years, which was the standard. And we've just been having the issues since 2016. So if you really think about 2016 to 2022, if some people were just, even to this time right now, we are dealing with people that are just discovering this issue, believe it or not, in our town. And we've just expanded now over to Londonderry and added a rep from over there. So yeah, I think it was mostly because if you're looking back to the 2016, it would be probably take us to 2022. So that's one of the reasons, but I'm not really sure because I wasn't privy to that meeting also.
Okay, thank you. Do you need to follow up, Senator Khan?
I would like to follow up, and I'm sorry to extend the length of this hearing, but we've had testimony previously with the Senate that it takes a while for cases to appear. So someone might say, well, you had reasonable notice because your neighbor had developed something, but I just am wondering, Senator French asked the question, why is there any limitation here if a person feels that they've got no family history and they can make a link between the diagnosis of a link that occurs later in life.
And I agree. And getting back to the firefighting, it's mostly firefighting foams, and like you said, they can go all the way up until they're now with the bill that we passed is 70. So I'm not adverse to it going any longer, as long as possible. Also, I have no issue with that. But that's what they settled on at 6 in this one, and I'll sign on to that. If it ends up being amended to be longer, that's fine. Also,
thank you, Representative.
Thank you so much.
Are there any further questions for Representative Healy? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much, Representative. Next, we're going to go to David Creer.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for letting me speak today. I'm David Creer, Director of Public Policy at the Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire. BIA opposes this bill. The main crux is that it's simply not necessary. I think there is some confusion on the way statute of limitations actually work in the state. So the standard statute of limitations is 3 years. However, the statute of limitations doesn't actually begin to toll until you have an injury and you link it to the cause of that injury. So this is pretty common even with things like medical malpractice. You might undergo surgery, and then 15, 20 years later, you discover, oh, the doctor left his watch in my abdomen. Well, now you have 3 years from that point to file your lawsuit. It doesn't begin to toll when you have surgery. It begins once you discover that injury and have a causal link to the injury. So same thing would be true with PFAS. if you're exposed to PFAS chemicals and then 15 years down the line you get sick, well, that point is when you start to have those 3 years. So extending it to 6 years wouldn't solve any of the problems that is being proposed. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Creer. Senator French has a question for you.
And thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Creer. So if it wouldn't solve any of the problems with discovery, would it create any problems by extending it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it was asked earlier too, why do we have statute of limitations at all? The issue is statute of limitations have been decided generally that it's good public policy to not hang the threat of lawsuits over people's heads indefinitely. You don't want to necessarily think that a bar fight you got into in college 10 years ago, now you're going to be sued for it. And it also helps to create expedient and appropriate and quality justice. As time goes on, evidence is lost, people's memories start to fade, and it creates kind of a weird situation where justice wouldn't be as quality as it could be if you create these statute of limitations, which kind of force people to, okay, you have an injury, you have a cause of action here, file your suit, let it start. That way, we can get a remedy as soon as possible.
Follow up?
Yes, follow up.
Thank you. So yes, I do agree. And in most instances, the statute of limitations is very good because memories change. And you don't want it hanging over your head forever. But in this case, isn't this case different from most of those?
Well, I mean, like I alluded to before, the thing with PFAS is that it is a very emotional issue, but the issue with it being a latent injury is really no different than something like medical malpractice. The injury occurred some time ago. It takes a while for that injury, or I guess the cause of the injury occurred some time ago, and then the injury arises some point down the line. That's when you can sue. So there's really no benefit to adding or creating an extra 6-year statute of limitations. However, what it does do is it signals to everyone in the state that, we're trying to make it as hard as possible for businesses to do their business here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions for Mr. Creer? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Mr. Creer. Margaret, that's all I have of folks who signed up to speak. Are there folks in the waiting room?
We do have one hand raised, Dawn Preventure.
Okay, let's hear from Mr. Preventure.
Hi, this is Don Preventure. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Great, thank you. My name is Don Preventure. I am the chair of the Merrimack Village District Water District in Merrimack, New Hampshire. And I am in favor of this bill. I just think that there are so many new information, there's so much new information coming out about the harm that PFAS compounds appear to cause. And those were summarized very concisely by Representative Bob Healy, who just spoke before me. So I think it's important because the new information that keeps coming out, you don't have 3 years is not enough to really understand the full impact of these chemicals. Quite honestly, I'm not sure if even 6 years is enough. So, I would be fully in favor of an amendment to keep that statute of limitations as long as possible, because I think some of this information might not be known for even more than 6 years away. I certainly understand the position from Mr. Creer of the BIA. However, I don't believe that his description of what starts the statute of limitations is consistent with what we have been advised by our legal counsel. So I'm just a little bit hesitant on, accepting his representation of that, his discussion that he presented earlier. But anyways, I know there were a lot of decisions and agreements made in Merrimack that affect the water system. And the cost for PFAS treatment has gone up significantly. And there's just a whole slew of reasons why I think it's not prudent to keep the statute of limitations at what it is currently at 3 years. And I am in favor of this bill moving forward. So that's just something I wanted to let everybody know. And, I'm definitely in favor of this bill moving forward. I think for many reasons that I just stated, that I think it's something that this Judiciary Committee will hopefully move forward to the general vote in the Senate. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Provencher. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Khan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Provencher, for being here. I'm sure your life's been complicated and your job has been complicated by all of this. When was I'm sure there've been hearings on this in the town about the potential for contamination, right?
Yeah, I guess, since it was discovered in spring of 2016, I guess this is when it really all started.
Thank you. And if I may follow, Madam
Follow
Chair.
up.
And has the reach of the contamination, has that been mapped?
Well, that's continuing to unfold, but I am aware that there is a groundwater management zone that has been established in Merrimack that's tributable to one of the polluters. And I'm not sure if that is going to change in the future as more information becomes available of the severity of the impacts of PFAS. But certainly since 2016, the drinking water standards that were used to determine health, what level is acceptable to drink or not, those numbers have consistently gone down. So that kind of further represents the discussion that I presented about more information coming out showing that PFAS chemicals are more detrimental than originally thought, as the drinking water standards sort of follow that trajectory.
May I continue, Madam Chair?
Yes, please.
So have there been sequential maps so that they're updated, and has the reach of the groundwater sourcing of PFAS expanded since the original mapping?
Yes, if my memory serves me correctly, I believe when this first came out, there was a radius applied around the identified polluter. I forget what that number was. I want to say it started out as maybe a half a mile. That subsequently grew at least once or twice. And then as continued information became available and test results from groundwater from wells, the delineation of a groundwater management zone was completed by the DES. That was in March of 2018. And I think since then, there's been additional wells that have been tested that have been found to also have groundwater that is above the maximum contaminant level for the PFAS compounds. Now, there was a consent decree that might have limited that groundwater management zone boundary, but the fact of the matter is that as more wells outside that boundary are identified, that kind of presents the case that there is additional contamination that appears to have gone beyond that boundary, in my opinion.
So I think last question, Madam Chair.
Yes, please.
So, Mr. Provencher, then, additional testing. I mean, the question I think some of us are grappling with is 3 years, 6 years, any limitation. What is your sense of what a reasonable limitation ought to be?
Well, it certainly is longer than 3 years. I mean, if you look back at the when tobacco industry, when that came to light, that took decades to really find out what the harmfulness of tobacco was. And I think this is the new tobacco. PFAS is the new tobacco, and we got to give it time to find out exactly how significant the harm is. And just because you may have identified that a contamination existed at a certain date, we've been advised that in some instances that can set the statute of limitations clock ticking, and you might not find out the harm for many, many years later. So that's why I think it's a good idea to extend this. I don't know what number would be satisfactory. I know there was discussion previously in this committee meeting about something even longer than 6 years, and I'd be fully in support of that as well. But I think it's a situation where it's at 3 years now. Maybe there was a looking at doubling that, and in another 3 years from now, it's possible if that's not enough time, it can get extended again. So, I'm all for even giving it an open end even longer than 6 years. But, the way the bill is written as it is now, I'm fully in support with that. Anything that brings it over the 3-year limitation of what all civil actions statute of limitations apply to, I think that's just not enough. It needs to be extended quite a bit more. So I'd say at least 6 years, and maybe something even longer. I wouldn't even be opposed to 10 years or something like that either.
Thanks for your answering the questions. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Senator Gannon, you have a question?
Yep. Thank you for your testimony. So I think a key thing for you would be to find out you're under the fear that the tolling is going to start earlier. So I've always been under the impression that these bills meant from when, so if you found out new information in 10 years in 2031, then you'd have 3 more years. So I'm thinking you're pretty much set, but you're thinking that the tolling begins earlier, or it possibly could. And that's your big problem, right? The tolling date.
Essentially, yes. And this is all interpretive, I believe, to some degree, based on the way a judge, sees this to some extent, right? So I'd be concerned that that interpretation, even though it may not be consistent with, the way you're looking at it or others are looking at it, there's always that risk there. And, that just going back to what I've been told is what could be construed as the starting of the statute of limitations is something more earlier than what others might agree with.
Quick follow-up.
Yes, please.
I think it's already been settled in law. We had asbestos bills years ago, and we had tolling things. So I think it's more fixed than you and I realize, and I will look into that for you.
Thank you.
Are there other further questions for Mr. Provencher? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Mr. Provencher. Margaret, is there anyone else?
Yes, we have Counselor Barbara Healy with a hand up.
Okay, let's move to Counselor Healy.
Counselor Healy.
Hi there, am I here?
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much. I
Could you
just wanted
please
to make
introduce yourself for the record?
My name is Barbara Healy, and I am one of the town councilors for the town of Merrimack.
Thank you.
And the reason I'm testifying today is, I do agree with the gentleman from BIA who stated that, yes, this is a statute of limitations and it should be adequate with what we have. But, I just want to bring out a point that hasn't been made before. Representative Mooney had said that these were called the forever chemicals. And that is because they persist in groundwater, air, soil, wastewater, etc., for years. But they also persist in the human body. And I am a retired registered nurse, so I can at least speak to this point. In the body, it's a cumulative effect. So if you eat or drink food that has PFAS in it today, and you stop today, that PFAS in your body is going to be there for years. If you continue to drink or eat material that has PFAS in it, it actually accumulates in your body exponentially. So unlike in a surgical procedure where, as it was stated, the doctor leaves his watch in your abdomen, this is not the same case at all. This just continues to go on and increase the level of PFAS that is in your body. So as Mr. Preventer just got through stating, sometimes that will take years before you actually have that negative effect on your body and your health. Not only that, but because the effects of the PFAS on your body, such as it affecting your thyroid, your metabolism, causing cancer, you have to be able to rule out other causative agents that might have led to that disease state as well. This is why that the request is being made to increase the statute of limitations to 6 years. And actually, as several of you had said, why not make it with no statute of limitations? And that is actually the ideal. Why wasn't it requested in the first place? I don't think people were very optimistic they could get that through, because they knew there would be lobbyists who would come out and say, oh no, you don't need to do this. But I don't think the lobbyists totally understand the effect that these chemical compounds, all possibly 5,000 of them, what that effect is long-term on your body. So I thank you for allowing me to speak today and point this out so that you have a little greater understanding of how the cumulative effects of PFAS may affect people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions for Counselor Healy? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Okay, Margaret, anyone else?
We have no other hands raised.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and close House Bill 236, and I'm going to put the committee in recess until 10 minutes of 3.
Bill, you can go.
Hey, Jenny, about 2 people want to testify in each of these, so take about 5 minutes per bill.
Yeah, no, I think we'll be out of here in less than 5 minutes, Senator, you know?
It's the speed round, 1 minute. Boom, 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 boom.
I think we're going with 3, but I am sure everyone will strive to
It's
be.
good
as
Senator
efficient as
Carson's here,
possible.
otherwise we would have had the lightning round.
These are technical housekeeping bills, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they're not, but we're going to do our diligence. We're going to listen and we'll come up with a conclusion, as we always do.
I already have.
Okay, well,
I have animal crackers, Harold. We're all set for a long, long time.
well, this one has 8 pages and the other one has 15. That's people who've signed up.
Yeah, not
Oh.
speaking.
Not speaking, no, it's not that bad. It's not as bad. House Bill 542 has more speakers, but
Good.
I would say probably by 4:30, we should be tired. We should be done. So that's
to
why I
shoot
wanted
for it.
everybody to have a break. I ate my chocolate bar and
Got
we
my
should be
cookie.
able- You have a cookie. My problem is I just can't eat one cookie.
Well, that's true. I have the same problem.
Dried apricots. You can have.
Yeah. How
Oh,
could I have
God.
guessed?
No.
No, dried apricots are very, very good. I
They
like them
are.
as well. Okay, I have 251. The committee is going to come out of recess. And I am going to open the public hearing on House Bill 440 and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Kofold. Kofold? Okay, there we go. Good afternoon, Representative.
Yes, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Great. Thank you so much for hearing my testimony. So House Bill 440 is, as amended and passed by the House, is aimed at clarifying the emergency order statute to ensure that civil liberties are not suspended or limited during a state of emergency. So as I'm sure you know, there have been a number of bills that have been introduced this session that deal with the state of emergency in one form or another. Some of those are aimed at broadly curtailing or changing the emergency orders. Some of them are aimed at specific measures that have been taken and concerns that people have about measures that could potentially be taken. And I would actually put this bill in a different category. This is really not aimed at fundamentally changing the emergency order statute. And it's not aimed at anything specific. For example, this bill is really not an anti-mask bill. It's not an anti-vaccine bill. The very limited scope of this bill is to clarify that the legislature does not intend that the Constitution or constitutional rights may be limited or suspended during a state of emergency. So while that may sound like a somewhat unlikely scenario, it is actually the position of the New Hampshire Superior Court at this time that the governor may suspend or limit constitutional rights during a state of emergency. And so that is a direct quote actually from a court case that was heard last year. And if you look around New Hampshire right now, you'd probably not know that we're living in a situation where that is the current state of law. Because I don't think that any of the measures that have been taken are overtly or inarguably violating the Constitution. So, people are not being arrested and held without bail. We still have a right to free speech. We still have a right to exercise religion and so forth. But it is the current state of the position of the Superior Court in New Hampshire that the governor may limit or suspend constitutional rights during a state of emergency. So essentially what this bill does is simply to clarify that civil liberties shall on no account be suspended, nor shall the United States Constitution or the New Hampshire Bill of Rights be suspended, set aside, or infringed. So this is very, very narrowly crafted. It is intentionally crafted very narrowly. It is not intended to really change anything that might have been implemented over the past 14 months. It's simply to clarify that going forward, the courts should apply normal constitutional scrutiny to cases that come before it, even during a state of emergency. I would note that this bill passed the House on a bipartisan vote. We had people from both sides of the aisle vote for it, including former Speaker of the House, Steve Shurtleff. And I'd like to publicly thank him and others on both sides of the aisle who voted for this bill. Passing this bill would bring us into good company with other states, including Maine. Again, the governor has flexible enumerated powers to deal with a state of emergency. This bill would not change that. It would simply ensure that in any challenges to a governor's actions in the future, that courts would conduct ordinary constitutional analysis rather than simply declaring that civil liberties are suspended. So that concludes my testimony for House Bill 440, and I will take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Senator Gannon has a question.
Just help me a little bit. So you're saying that we'll say that there was a variant and it's 50% fatal, so it's a horrible thing. It would then go to a court and they would and he says you can't go to church or says something. The governor comes out with a proclamation. And is it going to be then go to the court to decide if he's doing the right thing under a strict scrutiny test, saying there's no other possible narrowly tailored thing to do but what he's decided? So it's still going to give him some times that he can suspend civil liberties?
Right. The real purpose of this bill is to ensure that normal constitutional scrutiny applies. Okay. So it may be helpful if I explain a little bit about the Superior Court decision last year. In that decision, the court actually did not find that any actions taken by the governor were unconstitutional, even when normal constitutional scrutiny was applied. The court simply said that as long as a governor acts in good faith, with the belief that a suspension of certain civil liberties is important, that the governor may limit or suspend constitutional rights. So, the example I might give is that if a governor determined that news coverage of an emergency event was causing general panic and concern, and wanted to therefore shut down First Amendment rights, freedom of the press specifically, that if he or she were acting in good faith, that would essentially, that the emergency powers statute would essentially extend that power to them. This would clarify that normal constitutional scrutiny would need to apply under those circumstances.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Senator Carson.
Sorry, the dogs were barking. Are there any further questions for Representative Kofa? Senator Khan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative, for taking so I remember this case fairly well, having been on the fiscal committee a year ago. And so I wonder, what are your feelings towards Chapter 9, Section 13, which gives the legislature this kind of emergency authority?
I would have to look at that. I guess my general feeling is that neither the legislature nor the governor has the right to override constitutional rights. So I think in determining the constitutionality of a specific act, the courts are required to look at past precedent. They're to look at existing law, and I would say that in the case of a governor or of the legislature taking actions that are in violation of fundamental constitutional rights, I would take the position that with the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, that ultimately constitutional rights should prevail regardless of what a governor or the legislature says. So, yeah, I guess that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Representative, I have a few questions. I've listened to your testimony, and perhaps you can explain something. I'm looking at page 2, beginning on line 3, where it says you're talking about the Benford decision. And it says, yet the Superior Court exceeded its authority to the extent that it purported to authorize the governor to suspend or infringe upon the New Hampshire Bill of Rights or the United States Constitution. I just have some difficulty with that language. Can you explain that, please?
Well, I would take the position again that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that the legislature alone cannot violate the Constitution. The governor alone cannot violate the Constitution, nor can the legislature and the governor acting in concert violate the Constitution. I don't believe that it is a viable decision for the Superior Court to take the position that constitutional rights may be overridden by an executive order. And so whether it is done under statute established by the legislature or not. And so I think that's the intention with which that statement was made.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with some questions. The governor, if I remember correctly, went ahead and suspended these, but that was affirmed by the court, if I'm correct. And I will have to read the Benford decision. I will conclude that I have not. But it was my understanding that the law was changed back in 2002, I believe it was, and that was in response to the crisis this country was in for 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And some things had to be done. And just to go forward a little bit, I'm looking again on page 2, beginning on line 30. You say, to clarify that the general court never intended that emergency powers granted to the governor would be used. Can you tell me how that has been determined?
I think with the passage of this bill, that would be determined. I don't believe that the legislature intended that. I've spoken with some of the people who were involved with the passage of that bill originally, and it was not their intention. But let me also address, I think the first question that you were asking with regard to. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. The Benford decision. And just as a point of clarification, the Benford decision actually did not, the judge in that decision did not rule that anything was or would normally be unconstitutional, but was allowed under the emergency powers. In other words, the judge in that case established that actions taken by the governor under any and all circumstances would pass constitutional scrutiny. At the same time, in that decision, the judge wrote that the governor may limit or suspend constitutional rights during a state of emergency. So in essence, the judge was saying, well, you haven't violated constitutional rights here. So certain restrictions, specifically restrictions on freedom of assembly, are not unconstitutional. But if they were, there would potentially be a different standard applied under a state of emergency in which we would not apply a normal constitutional test. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think perhaps we're reading this a little differently, and I'm just troubled by the legislative findings section. The other question that I had, and again, it goes on to definitions, beginning on page 3, notwithstanding, beginning line 20, notwithstanding the foregoing enumerated powers, civil liberties shall on no account be suspended, nor shall the United States Constitution or the New Hampshire Bill of Rights be suspended, set aside, or otherwise infringed. Could you discuss that a little bit with us?
Yeah, so essentially, I guess this really comes down to the question of the supremacy of the Constitution, that the Constitution is the baseline from which everything else emerges and from which everything else operates. And so this is what when I describe this bill as a clarification of the existing statute. It is exactly that. It is that the emergency order statute is intended to grant the governor powers which are necessary under a state of emergency. That is to take action without necessarily getting the acquiescence of the legislature. And I think that is important, and I believe that it was important and entirely valid for the current situation. All this is saying is that civil liberties may not be suspended. I can give you another example, which is, after Hurricane Katrina, there was a fairly widely publicized set of incidents in which law enforcement was going door to door, seizing people's firearms. And this subsequently went to court, and it was ruled that that was an unconstitutional seizure, and yet it happened. In the current, in current New Hampshire law, that type of seizure of firearms is explicitly prohibited. I guess the question really comes down to whether or not emergency orders provide a level of lawmaking, essentially, by executive order that supersedes existing law, or that supersedes the Constitution of our state or the Constitution of the federal government. This legislation takes the position that it does not, that the governor must still act 100% within the confines of United States and New Hampshire constitutional constraints.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that it is very clear that any civil liberty shall not be suspended, and it goes on to say, nor shall the United States Constitution or the New Hampshire Bill of Rights be suspended, set aside, or otherwise infringed. My final question to you is, Representative, why didn't you file this as a constitutional amendment as opposed to a piece of legislation?
Well, there were a couple of things. First of all, the history of this bill is it actually started out as a somewhat different bill. It was amended to its current form largely because of a court or a series of court decisions, one of which was the Benford decision, subsequently the Mack decision, and so that's basically the reason why this was introduced as a bill, not as a CACR. I think that it could well be introduced as a CACR. To me, really, since it is specifically pertains to the emergency powers statute, though, it seems to me that the clarification, or as a clarification of the emergency statute, that it's probably fundamentally belongs in the emergency statute. The Constitution already says that certain rights are inalienable. In Part 1 of the New Hampshire Constitution, we see that phrase, or that word unalienable, repeated a number of times. So it seems clear to me that the constitutional intent is already there, but that we just need a clarification on the emergency statute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering my questions. Are there any further questions for Representative Kofalt? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to go to Representative Silber.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm speaking in support of this. My name is Norman Silber. I'm a state representative from Belknap County, District 2, representing the towns of Guilford and Meredith. I'm a member of the New Hampshire Bar and of the Florida Bar, and I've been a member of the Federalist Society for several decades. For those who are not familiar with the Federalist Society, it was formed about 30 years ago with a group of students from the law schools of Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. And basically, its goals are to protect individual liberty and interpret the Constitution according to its original meaning. So I've been involved with the Federalist Society for a long time, although I'm speaking today on my own personal beliefs, not as a representative of the Federalist Society. I read the Benford Opinion. This was brought to my attention by Representative Kofold, who I've done a lot of matters with. And I read the Benford decision, and frankly, I was astounded and shocked and disappointed that it was not appealed to the state Supreme Court so that we could get a determination by the state Supreme Court on whether or not our Constitution and the US Constitution rights can be suspended. In my research on this, there's a very similar situation that occurred in the state of New York. And in late November, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn sued the New York governor for his actions in limiting the ability of people to exercise their First Amendment rights and the rights under the New York Constitution for the free exercise of religion. And in a 5-4 decision, the US Supreme Court said, basically, you can't do that. Some of the language are sort of interesting. I'll just quote a couple of things. Even in a pandemic, the Constitution cannot be put away and forgotten. Probably the best analysis is a concurring opinion by Justice Gorsuch. He starts out by saying government is not free to disregard the First Amendment in times of crises. And he goes through an analysis. And basically, we talked, and it sounds like several members of the committee are aware that there are 3 levels of scrutiny that the courts apply when constitutional violations are suspected. And the strictest is called strict scrutiny. And when you are dealing with fundamental rights like First Amendment rights, strict scrutiny is the standard. And under strict scrutiny, this really, the stuff that has gone on where this in the Benford decision that has approved actions that violate the New Hampshire Constitutional Bill of Rights and the US Constitutional Bill of Rights, which I've made presentations on to a lot of schools, it's just astounding to me, and it needs to be corrected. And that's the whole purpose of this bill. So, I strongly recommend if anybody really wants to get into the weeds, that they pull up this Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. And you will see that is quite a good explanation of these concepts. And basically, I think that this bill ought to pass. So I urge you to pass it. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you very much, Representative. Are there any questions for Representative Silber? Senator Gannon has a question.
I didn't go to those prestigious law schools, so I'm a little jealous of you. But
I didn't go to them either.
Oh, okay. I didn't know why they let you in the club then. I'm just a blue collar lawyer. So, but I do remember strict scrutiny. And so again, I'm on page 3, paragraph 3. And so it says no account. So would that on line 26, no account shall civil liberties be denied? Doesn't that even eliminate strict scrutiny? Or am I reading it wrong?
The bill says what a court, an appellate court, determines it says. And we know that that's the way it works. That's the way the system works. Sure. And so in a situation where some action is challenged, that it says it violates this provision that's being added, it's going to be an argument of both sides, and the court is going to have to decide. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I'm sorry. And I did not go to any of those prestigious law schools. I'm just a poor Southern
I'm always,
boy.
I'm
And I
always
went-
looking for the easy answers, but thank you.
I'm a graduate of Tulane University, so.
I bet you had fun down there in New
Oh,
Orleans.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, are there any further questions for Representative Silber? Okay, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, we've taken the testimony from the folks who have signed up as elected officials to introduce the bill to us. I'm going to be moving on to our 3-minute rule because we have a number of folks who have signed up to testify. So that means you are going to have 3 minutes to talk to us about whether you believe the bill should pass or it should fail. And we're going to ask you to please keep your comments to things that we have not heard before. So please do not read written testimony. Don't repeat things. We're interested in new things that haven't been discussed. So at this point, we're going to move on to the next person that I have is Ian Hewitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Ian Hewitt, General Counsel at Cornerstone, appearing in support of HB 440. And in case I run out of time, I'll just say at the outset, I'm happy to address any legal questions, including those that have already been discussed. And it sounds like that most members of the Judiciary Committee are aware of this, but I'll just give a ground level explanation of judicial scrutiny and how it relates to the idea of suspension. Now, for different kinds of constitutional challenges under ordinary everyday legal analysis, there are different levels of scrutiny. So we're going to hear a religious liberty case next. And in a religious liberty case, once I show my religious exercise has been burdened, the government applies what's called strict scrutiny. Is this action narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest? For other kinds of rights, there might be different scrutiny, like intermediate scrutiny. Now, here's what's key, that if that test can be passed by the government can do the action. If it can pass strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, it can do the action. So when you hear people say rights are not absolute, this is what they mean, is that when the government passes that test, it can do the action. The Constitution doesn't, categorically prohibit from the government from doing things that it needs to do in an emergency. Now, what happens under a suspension theory? And I would encourage, more than any other bill I've testified on this session, I'd really encourage all the members of the committee to read through the legislative findings, since they explain the need for this bill with quotations and citations. What a suspension theory does is, under a suspension theory, during a state of emergency, the courts do not apply any of these tiers of scrutiny. Instead, they simply ask, was this action taken in good faith? And was there some factual basis for the action? If they answer both those questions yes, their court's inquiry is at an end, and the court simply upholds the government action. So I pretty much entirely agree with Senator Gannon's characterization in his initial question to Representative Kofalt. What I would add is that since that is what suspension is, suspension means to only ask, is there good faith and some factual basis? We would say that suspension should never be applied. There should never be a case of suspension. The government can act in an emergency by passing ordinary constitutional scrutiny, but rights can't be suspended, meaning that constitutional scrutiny has to be applied. And in fact, there's a definition of suspension in this bill, Roman numeral 2 under definitions, that makes that clear. Suspension simply means to apply this extraordinary standard of requiring only good faith and some factual basis. Now, there's two other quick points I would make here. One is that this bill will not throw out things like mask orders, and it won't throw out things like capacity limits. So these are upheld by most courts around the country as constitutional under the ordinary constitutional analysis I talked about. And
Mr. Hewitt, we have reached the 3-minute mark.
Thank you. I'm happy to elaborate if there are questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there questions for Mr. Hewitt?
Could he have a minute
Yes.
and more time? It just explaining something I want to hear. Could he finish?
Okay,
it?
that's fine. Yes, please.
Go
Mr. Hewitt, can you
ahead.
continue? So
Yes, thank you,
Matt.
Senator Gannon. I appreciate that. Yeah, so under ordinary constitutional analysis, the government can do these kinds of things like mask orders and capacity limits, and we can see an example of this in Maine. So for the past 12 months, courts in Maine have been upholding things like this under ordinary constitutional analysis. The courts in Maine have made it very clear that they do not accept this suspension theory like our courts did. They apply ordinary constitutional analysis, and we don't see chaos in Maine. The government is able to do mask orders, it's able to do capacity limits, and Maine's rate of COVID infections for about the past year has been about the same as New Hampshire. So you just don't need to suspend constitutional rights. And then the second quick point I was going to make is the reason that this bill is necessary is that that standard under the suspension theory, good faith and some factual basis, is so broad that it will authorize almost any future abuse by the government that we can conceive of. I agree with the examples Representative Kofalt gave, and I would give one more historical example. The main court case that our Attorney General's office asked the Superior Court to apply, and that the Superior Court applied in Benford, was a case called Smith v. Avino, which was a non-binding case from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Smith v. Avino, which talked about suspending constitutional rights, was based on and cited a very famous decision you all have likely heard of called Korematsu v. United States, which was the US Supreme Court's decision upholding Japanese internment. That's actually historically where this idea in jurisprudence of suspending constitutional rights came from, is Korematsu. And the government's actions in Korematsu would easily pass this standard. I don't think anyone would dispute they were done in quote unquote good faith. The government thought it was the right thing to do, and there was some factual basis, quote unquote, for the decision. So in effect, any constitutional right can be treated as if it doesn't exist under this standard. This bill is a moderate, common sense bill that will bring us into line with other states like Maine and prevent tremendous potential abuse in the future in New Hampshire. And I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Hewitt. Are there any further questions for Mr. Hewitt from the committee? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Hewitt.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to go to Noel Teku.
Noel, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Noel.
Okay, next we're going to go to Daniel Wolfe.
Daniel, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Daniel.
Okay, next we'll go to Roy Dennehy.
Roy, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Roy.
Okay, let's go to Natasha Athens.
Natasha, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Natasha.
Okay, let's go to Victoria Gulla.
I have Victoria.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, Ms. Gulla.
Ms. Gulla, you should be able to unmute.
Yep. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Thank you. So I live in Spofford. I'm a resident of New Hampshire. I was born in Hancock, and I am in support of the bill. And I wanted to bring into consideration some of the history of the Constitution and things like inalienable rights that our founders had concerns during the Bill of Rights that if we enumerated rights, that the inalienable rights would possibly be thought to not be considered because they're so universal that if you enumerate rights, that there's a possibility that something's not enumerated, listed, that it might not be considered. So I wanted to read to you what Madison said during his floor speech. Originally, he was against the Bill of Rights for that very reason. But when he saw that it had to come This is what he has spoke and written in his floor speech. He said first that he wanted there to be a prefix to the Constitution, a declaration that all power is originally vested in, consequently derived from the people, that government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists of the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Further, he spoke and wrote, the exceptions here or elsewhere in this Constitution made in favor of particular rights shall not be so construed as to diminish the just importance of other rights retained by the people, or as to enlarge the powers delegated to the Constitution, but either as actual limitations of such powers or inserted merely for greater caution. Now, his language was based for the Ninth Amendment, which is very simple. It just states the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. They simplified that down, but as you can see, as one of the main writers of the Constitution, how important this was, that these rights are unalienable, cannot be stopped by courts, cannot be stopped by a single judge, and that there's a matter of some kind of an emergency should not make the governor able to be a potentate. Now, we have now been in this unjust, illegal, in my opinion, and it's most people's opinion, state of emergency. How long? For Sununu's entire 2-year term? What kind of an emergency is that? That he can suspend our rights. He has no power. The court is wrong. And I urge that you pass this law to correct the court in the, can't think of the name of the representative who said he was disappointed, didn't go to the Supreme Court. And I definitely concur with that. And I urge you to pass this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Gullah. Are there any questions for Ms. Gullah from the committee? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Ms. Gullah. Next, we're going to go to John Griffin.
John, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Mr. Griffin.
Okay, next we're going to move to Nicholas Davis.
Nicholas, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Nicholas.
Okay, that ends the folks that I have signed up to testify. If I'm sure there's some folks in the waiting room, and we will go through those folks.
If anybody else wishes to testify, you could virtually raise your hand. I see no hands raised.
No hands, okay. Then I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing on House Bill 440. Okay, I am going to go ahead and open the public hearing on the last bill that we are hearing today, and that is House Bill 542, and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Ammon.
Representative Ammon, if you could virtually raise your hand.
How was that?
Yeah, we hear you, Representative.
Okay, sorry about that. It's my pleasure to present House Bill 542 to the committee, and thank you, Madam Chair, and committee members. I'll try to keep my comments brief. I know some things went long before this, and that's understandable. For the record, my name is Keith Ammon. I represent Hillsborough District 40, towns of New Boston, Mount Vernon, Milford, and Hollis. And I'm introducing House Bill 542, which can be referred to as the New Hampshire Religious Liberty Act. We went through a pandemic. We talked about emergencies that happened around 9/11. And, you know, there's a sense of panic when these things happen. And once they're over or winding down, as the pandemic is, it's good for us to take a step back and analyze our reaction to, you know, that state of emergency. And this bill specifically focuses on religious liberty. And we know that that's a cornerstone, a keystone to a free society, because it means if you have religious liberty, it means that your conscience is free, that you are free to believe as you wish and worship as you wish. And, you know, through the reaction to the pandemic, there was a situation, whether it was, you know, explicit or implicit, where churches were closed, but the hardware store, the grocery store, and even the liquor stores were open. And so this bill does two things. The first is it makes sure that the state of New Hampshire, that the government of New Hampshire treats religious services, houses of worship, just as essential as, you know, Target, Walmart, or the grocery store. And I think that would be that's a good correction, having gone through the pandemic. This bill does not prevent the state government from putting capacity restrictions or mask requirements, just as it would on other businesses, on houses of worship or religious gatherings. But it ensures that you know, religious liberty is protected, especially during, you know, a time of emergency. The second thing that this does is it, I think it was mentioned, Representative Kofolt mentioned the Mack decision, which was a decision by the New Hampshire Supreme Court back in December of 2020 that affirms New Hampshire's free exercise clause as being very broadly determined, and that it's even it provides more rights even than the U.S. Supreme Court and how they've interpreted since 1990 the First Amendment, the free exercise clause in the First Amendment of the federal Constitution. And so it puts into statute what's already quote unquote the law of the land based on Supreme Court decision in the Mack case. And put simply, the decision says that in cases affecting religious practice, New Hampshire courts have to apply our state free exercise clause, which I mentioned is stronger than the federal free exercise clause. And that legal test set out in this bill is exactly the same as the test in the Mack decision. And it's basically that the government, if the government has a compelling interest, let's say in a state of emergency or maybe a time of war, that it can further that compelling interest as long as it does it, you know, in the realm of religious liberty, as long as it does it in the least restrictive manner or with the least restrictive means. I've heard opposition to the bill saying that the idea of protecting religious liberty in the courts would cause chaos. But as I mentioned, this is already the law of the land based on a Supreme Court decision in our state. And we don't see people getting away with running red lights or doing things in the name of religion. What we see is that our courts are protecting sincere religious exercise, and we want that to continue. So I know behind me are several pastors, and we've heard, you know, testimony in the House, and I'll just give you just a preview, is the houses of worship, communities of faith were essential in spiritual health, mental, and even physical health during an emergency. So we'd want to not shut down that support for our citizens, but make sure that we protect it and allow it to assist our society to go through a future emergency, God forbid. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions for Representative Ammon? Okay, we don't see any. Thank you very much, Representative.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, next, we're going to go to Gilles Bissonnette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Gilles Bissonnette. I'm the legal director of the ACLU of New Hampshire. We're here in opposition today to HB 542, which is often termed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's the type of terminology we've heard describing these bills in other states where they've come up over the past several years. So I'm going to use, if it's okay, I'm going to use the term RFRA when I talk about these bills. So despite this bill's amended analysis addressing houses of worship and states of emergency, I want to be clear that this bill really is sweeping and it's not limited to this narrow issue or states of emergency. To the contrary, this bill, frankly, would undermine New Hampshire's law against discrimination, and that's in Chapter 354-A, and give businesses a license to use religion to engage in discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the other suspect classes that are in Chapter 354-A, which govern discrimination in places of, in part, in places of public accommodations. And I think also in doing so, this bill would really undermine HB 1319, if you recall, which was the historic bipartisan effort in 2018 to protect transgender individuals from discrimination in public accommodations and other contexts under New Hampshire's law against discrimination. And really, again, that effort was historic, garnered support from Governor Sununu, Senator Bradley, and others. HB 542, it contains two critical provisions that I want to flag for the committee that, at least in my view, make clear that it's designed to allow a business to discriminate against a person despite the provisions that exist under 354A. And so the first is page 3, lines 6 through 7. So those provisions of that bill would give anyone the right to argue that they do not have to follow state or local laws, including basic civil rights laws, under the notion that following those laws would violate religious rights. And this is because it would allow private individuals and businesses to assert religious beliefs in a way that could lead to discrimination against not just gay and transgender folks, but potentially anyone who doesn't share their beliefs. And again, that's because, frankly, the definition of person is quite broad and includes association, partnerships, corporations, etc. And the second provision I wanted to flag for the committee is page 4, lines 9 through 12. So what this bill would do is allow for-profit businesses, employees, individuals, basically anyone, to assert a legal claim or defense of free exercise of religion in a legal proceeding, regardless of whether the government is actually a party to the proceeding. So in other words, a business's free exercise right is not simply a defense against actions brought by the government, but more importantly is a defense against a private lawsuit by another person or another entity, including a private lawsuit brought by a person claiming a religious freedom right to discriminate, notwithstanding the provisions of our law against discrimination. So taken together, we believe that these provisions reveal that this bill really can in practice be used to allow businesses to exempt themselves essentially from our civil rights laws. This may all sound familiar. If we saw a wave of these bills 4 to 5 years ago before COVID, right? And this bill is in fact quite similar to SB 1062, which is from Arizona back in 2014. That bill was vetoed after a significant backlash, including from the corporate community and other advocates. We also saw a similar bill that was enacted in Indiana in 2015. It was subsequently rolled back. So this really, in my view, is not about states of emergency. This type of bill has been in existence for 5-6 years now. And we just don't think it has any place in New Hampshire, particularly given the bipartisan efforts here in New Hampshire to make sure that our law against discrimination is meaningful in public accommodations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Whitley has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my question, Attorney Bissonnette. So you mentioned the similar laws that had passed in Indiana and Arizona, I believe. And I remember there was significant backlash from the business community with the passage of those bills. Isn't that correct?
There was, absolutely.
And are you aware of what the basis of their issues were?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they were potentially, well, I think number one, it was just philosophical that they didn't want to necessarily support or continue operations and do their business in a state that allowed for discrimination and public accommodations, which this very well could do. And I think number two, the reason likely was practical, and that they could potentially subject themselves to litigation, right? With a type of RFRA bill like this being enacted, because if one of their employees decides to discriminate, say, using religion as a basis to do so against, say, a customer, they couldn't take any action necessarily or significant action against that employee or risk litigation if they decided to do that, because of course that employee could use religion as a defense if there was any discipline imposed. So I think those are really the two main reasons, but the backlash was swift in both states. We've seen a little bit of a resurgence in these types of bills over the past 6 months or so as well.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? Attorney Bissonnette, I'm looking on page 5, lines 8 and 9. It's waiving the qualified immunity from sovereign governmental entities. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I know that's been a hot debate, Madam Chair, in other contexts. Certainly that debate could potentially be, at issue here. I would have to ask the drafters, I guess, probably what they're trying to get at with something like this, but I suspect it's designed to, create a cause of action which monetary damages could be imposed in the event that an individual thinks a government agent or the government violated his, her, or their religious liberties.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any further questions for Attorney Bissonnette? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to Ian Hewitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Ian Hewitt, General Counsel at Cornerstone, speaking in support of House Bill 542. Representative Ammon already gave a pretty comprehensive legal discussion, and I don't want to be duplicative, so I'll mostly just respond to some of the things that we've heard from the ACLU. And I'd like to reiterate that this bill does basically two things. As Representative Ammon said, one, it clarifies that churches, religious organizations cannot be treated more harshly than other entities in a state of emergency. The other thing it does is to codify in state law what we've just heard called RFRA protections. But what it's really doing is just codifying already New Hampshire's free exercise protections for religious practice and religious organizations. Let me read you a quotation from State v. Mack. This is a decision from the New Hampshire Supreme Court in December, construing not a statute, not a RFRA, but our state free exercise clause. The court there said, under Part 1, Article 5, that's our state free exercise clause, once an individual establishes that the government action substantially burdens his or her sincere religious practice, the burden shifts to the state to show both that the government action is necessary to achieve a compelling government interest and is narrowly tailored to meet that end. That is exactly the same test that's codified in this bill in what we've heard the ACLU describe as RFRA protections. So I want to emphasize that Cornerstone, wouldn't be crazy about this, but hypothetically, if this committee were to strike everything from this bill, except the statements that churches cannot be treated worse than other entities in states of emergency, and then passed it, we would be in exactly the same position as if this committee approved the bill unamended, because these protections are already in our state free exercise clause. And we heard nothing about that, about the Mack decision or our state free exercise clause from the ACLU. Now, constitutional rights like the free exercise clause can exempt people from statutes that would otherwise be applicable. But the idea of a constitution is statutes can be rendered inapplicable in certain cases. For example, we have a ministerial exception. You can't tell churches who to hire and fire. But that's really just stating the whole idea behind having a constitution. As our Supreme Court once said, I think aptly, we don't have unqualified majority rule. We have majority rule with protection for individual rights. And I think it's interesting we heard about bipartisanship, because the history of so-called RFRA laws that try to codify in statute general free exercise protections, is that in the 1990s, these laws were very bipartisan. Actually, as early as last year, the ACLU still had on its website, they hadn't taken it down yet, statements saying that it deplored judicial decisions undercutting free exercise protections, and it supported what we've heard described as RFRA-like tests. This is called the Sherbert test sometimes. It supported the Sherbert test. Christian organizations like the Christian Legal Society and the ACLU were all on the same side of this issue in 1990. It's only when, unfortunately, the dynamics of our culture shifted and it began to be Christians and not other religious minorities that began to use free exercise protections that we saw the ACLU conveniently change its position and now take the position that these kinds of protections are somehow invidious or authorized discrimination. The only other thing I'll note is that under this kind of test, and this is very similar to the bill we recently discussed, the government can still impose upon religious practice if it passes that test. So this is something the government might be able to do if a business, for example, is discriminating in terms of public accommodation, like renting housing. Where this kind of protection is going to kick in and help religious practice is if the government is trying to tell a church who to hire and fire, or it's forcing businesses to be involved in particular ceremonies they disagree with. These are maybe kinds of scenarios that the ACLU might like to see occur, but historically they would have been impermissible under US constitutional law. They would already be impermissible under our state free exercise clause under the Mack decision. And this bill will simply reaffirm that, as well as adding a needed protection for states of emergency. And I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions for Attorney Hewitt? Senator French.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. Are you aware that there's 4,300 recognized worldwide religions today?
I don't know if I'd heard that exact number, but I know that there's many.
Do you think maybe it'd be difficult to exclude them all from all the possibilities of what might occur with something like this?
Well, good. I'm glad you brought that up, Senator French. So this is, and Keith Ammon alluded to this, this is a common argument against the idea of substantive free exercise protections, is that it will cause chaos and be unworkable, in part because, as you said, religious beliefs are so diverse and varied. So there are a couple things I'd point you to here. One is the New Hampshire Supreme Court's findings in the Mack decision. I'm happy to send this decision to the committee, but it's also on justia.com. And on page 21 of that decision, the court finds the compelling state interest balancing test has proven to be workable in free exercise cases. So, the court found this is workable. It's already the law in New Hampshire. It's been the law in December. As Representative Ammon said, we don't see people running red lights and saying, I can do this because it's my religion, or selling marijuana, claiming they can get away with it because of the free exercise clause, these kinds of things. And the other, and this is the most important point I would make, is that this test, what's called the Sherbert test, you can call it by other names, the ACLU called it RFRA. This test was the law everywhere in the United States under federal constitutional law from 1943 until 1990. But we didn't see Americans evading taxes and doing other kinds of crazy things under the guise of religion. So I think that the record, both here in New Hampshire in the last 5 months and for decades in terms of federal constitutional law, is that this doesn't lead to frivolous or bogus claims, and that the courts can do just fine detecting these kinds of bogus, silly, unworkable claims. And that what we really see in practice is churches, religious organizations, their rights are being protected in a sensible way under this analysis that balances the needs of the state with people's protected constitutional rights.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Are there any further questions for Attorney Hewitt? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we're going to go to Laura Randall.
Laura, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Laura.
Okay, next, then we're going to go to Josh Hirschberger.
Josh, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Josh.
Okay. Next, we're going to go to Tagan Juice. That's Joos.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and the members of the committee. Appreciate your allowance for me to speak. My name is Tegan Jose, two unusual names, but appreciate you allowing me to speak. I am the pastor of Heritage Baptist Church in Dover, and I'm testifying today in support of HB 542. I'm thankful today that this bill is coming before you as it brings up a necessary point of discussion for all in political office, being the essential nature of churches and other places of worship to the overall health, stability, and well-being of our citizens. Should churches be considered essential? I think that is a good question to pose, and I would give a resounding yes, they should. Churches are an essential component of the well-being of the people of our state. There are tremendous spiritual and relational needs of our people, and churches are a large and vital segment of our society to help people in those areas. When the pandemic hit last year, our church, when we were not meeting together in person each week, I, like many pastors, we were trying to minister to our people as best we could. 2020 for pastors, I've spoken with pastors all over the country. It was probably the most difficult year of ministry for all of us in a variety of ways. Trying to minister to people when we can't be with them physically is a difficult thing to do. One thing that my family did personally for our church family specifically was just a simple thing to bake cookies for people. And we hand delivered them, went to their houses. You know, we kept the social distancing, but we gave them these cookies, and it was just an opportunity to see them face to face, family by family, to encourage them, to hear what they were struggling through. And I found that this personal time with them was so encouraging and needful, and it cannot be duplicated through a screen. You know, as a pastor, it was difficult for me to understand why some businesses last year were considered essential when churches were not. One of the basic reasons our nation was founded was to be able to gather freely based on our religious views. That freedom was ensured by our U.S. Constitution. It's also secured in our New Hampshire state constitution. But when the church's constitutional freedom to assemble and worship was seemingly cast aside as not essential, that was troubling. Troubling to me as a pastor and to many others that I know as well. Earlier today, as I was listening, someone referenced the case in November 25th of 2020, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Andrew Cuomo. And in that decision, Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch stated this, quote, "The only explanation for treating religious places differently seems to be a judgment that what happens there just isn't as, quote unquote, essential as what happens in secular spaces," end quote. And he concluded his opinion by saying this, quote, "It is time, past time, to make plain that while the pandemic poses many grave challenges, there is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that reopen liquor stores and bike shops, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques," end quote. So based on these, even what our Supreme Court has ruled already, I encourage you to support this bill, which helps to support both our US as well as our state constitutions. Thank you for our time, as well as for your service to our state.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to move to Nate Pikowitz.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we sure can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nate Pikowitz. I'm the pastor of Harvest Bible Church in Gilmanton Ironworks. I'm testifying in support of HB 542. So many things I could say. I want to be sensitive to time. Certainly, I echo everything that Pastor Jews had just said in terms of the value, the essential nature of the church and of religious organizations. Even in our own church, during the shutdown, we were able to provide food and supplies, services. I made phone calls and counseled people and prayed for them and tried to facilitate some semblance of online fellowship, as difficult as that was. I even brought people toilet paper. I mean, essential nature, you know. But that's really the secondary issue. The primary issue for us is to be able to worship who we believe to be our God with a free conscience, and to do so. And to go and be able to get a haircut or go to Lowe's and get wood, but yet still not be able to go to church, just struck against my personal conscience. And I know for lots of other people as well. I have to respectfully respond to the gentleman from the ACLU that said that in practice, this kind of a bill would do nothing except engender discrimination, when in truth, we were the ones that were discriminated against during the shutdown. When every other business was deemed essential and opened back up again, Senator Guida fought vigorously on our behalf to try to work to get guidance documents for the churches and for religious organizations so we could reopen again. And even during our governor's public statements, very seldom were the churches even mentioned. And so in opposition to receiving discrimination against other folks, I mean, we were the recipient of discrimination ourselves. So that was certainly disheartening. But the whole idea behind this is that the churches are essential. We provide value. We minister to people. We help them in the times of crisis. One final comment. A good friend of mine who's a pastor struggled because one of his parishioners had committed suicide, and he was very limited in how he could minister to that family who just lost their son. And other people in the church who wanted to be with this family to minister to them were unable. So you had a family that was by themselves after losing a child, but was still in obedience to the current mandates, unable to minister. And that just breaks my heart and certainly works against the whole purpose of why we gather for the free exercise of religion. Thank you very much for affording me this time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions for Mr. Pikowitz? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to move on to Peter Chamberlain.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the members of the committee for taking up this important issue. I'm Peter Chamberlain, and I pastor the Granite State Baptist Church right here in our wonderful capital city of Concord. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to be able to express what our heartfelt desires are. Everything has changed over the past 14 months, and we understand that. We understand that each human being is made up individually, we believe, in the very image of God. It's not just physical needs that need to be met, whether it be a grocery store or whether it be a hardware store, but yet we as pastors, when that is our heart, whether it be our church or our place of worship, and it is being told to close down or to limit attendance, to limit our outreach. May I say this, I support this bill being passed because of the opportunity that some did take to impose restrictions upon our places of worship. I do not believe that ought to take place. Personally, as we experienced it over the past 14 months, not just the humanitarian aid, not just the looking at a computer screen to be able to try to minister to people, but every week of my life, I personally deal with the addicted and those that are in recovery through ministries of our church. And I've personally asked several of them over the past year how this has impacted them. They can still get their shoes, they can still get their clothes, but the opportunity to be able to meet in person, not trying to do it unjustly, but to be able to have the face-to-face interaction, communication, and personal contact with people, it shouldn't be infringed upon inside of our churches and places of worship. There's not a one of them when I talk to them and I ask them specifically, how is your mental health and your condition over these past 12 to 14 months? Not a one of them has said that has improved. And so the ministry and the purpose of churches and places of worship is not just to go out into the community. It is not just to be a supply line, even though all of those are intentional and good, but the very meaning of the word church is an assembly. And an assembly is not something that is done most effective done over a computer screen. And so we did see, I don't know how many questions I had to answer as a pastor, that why is it our church is less than a mile from Home Depot? And why is it that I can go walk around Home Depot and there's hundreds of people inside there, but I can't come a half mile down the road and go sit in my place of worship to be able to worship in my God-given privilege to be able to do so. And so when we look at these subject matters, we know that the churches and places of worship have been mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. They're mentioned in our New Hampshire Constitution. Home Depot's not. The liquor store is not. We see these across our state. And so we are saying and asking for this to pass, because we're not looking for discrimination against people. That was absurd. Just bringing up that if this passes, that churches are looking to try to just be discriminatory through all of this. No, our entire purpose is to be able to spread the love of Christ in the free conscience of religion that God has given to us, and not to be treated worse than the liquor store and the hardware store and the Walmart and the Target, and that we would be deemed essential. And that's just a matter of words coming from the committee and the bill, but I would appreciate it, and our church would appreciate it. We've done everything we could. And I'll say this, I know some people come back and say, well, it's just a breeding ground through all of that. We are trained, and it's our heart's desire. Our number one goal is to be helping people. I don't believe they're a true minister and a true pastor if they're knowingly putting people in harm's way. So I don't know of one pastor, minister, no matter what religion or denomination, that has disregarded everything and safeguards. And so we're just asking that this passes, and that churches and places of worship are deemed essential, and this bill would move forward for future times that we have this. Thank you very much. I'm willing to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chamberlain. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Next, we're going to Jimmy Anand.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of the Senate Committee. My name is Jimmy Anand. I'm the Assistant Pastor at Elevate Church in Littleton, New Hampshire. I'm testifying in support of HB 542. First off, I'd like to say that the church is absolutely essential. And I believe that the fact that we even have to have a debate on this topic is a very sad commentary of the state of our country and our culture right now. As I understand it, freedom of religion and the church being essential is already settled in our U.S. Constitution, as well as our New Hampshire Constitution. The essential nature of the church is the bedrock on which this country is built, and our framers made sure that this is one of their foundations. I firmly believe that the chaos we're seeing in our nation right now is in part because of the church being told that they are not essential. We're seeing record rates of depression, suicide, substance abuse, domestic issues, and the list goes on and on. I believe this is a snapshot of what our nation would look like without the influence of the church. Just as we need places like grocery stores to sustain the physical part of us, we need our churches to sustain the spiritual part of us. We are not merely just a physical body, but a body made up of a soul and a spirit as well. My church has been a lifeline for many in our church family during these unprecedented times we have been in. We're not meant to live in isolation, devoid of human contact in this digital, virtual world we have been told to accept as the new normal. My church has allowed people to receive encouragement and prayer, as well as a sense of normalcy. My church has been able to bless our local police and teachers with gift cards to show them that they are appreciated. And finally, the last thing I want to leave you with is this. We have a man who attends our church who has struggled with alcoholism and drug abuse for many years before he found us, and we were able to help him receive victory over his addiction. After we had resumed in-person services after a period of time of being online, he told me something that I'll never forget. He looked at me and said that not being able to go to church nearly killed him, and if the church had to shut down again, that it would kill him. And I know that he was not using this as a figure of speech. He absolutely meant it. So we asked the question, is the church essential? My answer is a resounding yes. Thank you again, and I urge you to support this bill.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Senator French has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Reverend, for coming before us today. I have a few questions for you. Was your church ordered to shut down, or was it asked to limit the amount of participation?
I believe at the beginning of last year, it was ordered to shut down.
Were you notified of that?
I believe that the government did send us a notice.
And at what time did it reopen? Or was it allowed to reopen using protocols?
I believe that would be last June.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Are there any further questions for Mr. Annan? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to Neil Hubaker.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thanks for this time. My name is Neil Hubacher. I'm the director of Cornerstone's Church Ambassador Network. I'm testifying today in support of HB 542. One thing that really impressed me over this last year was the 200 and some odd churches that are in our network, just the great lengths that they've gone to. You've heard some already, the great lengths that they've gone to, not only to minister to their own people, but to meet the needs of the community around them. Not far from the church we just heard from Pastor Anand's in Berlin is a church called Harvest Christian Fellowship. And speaking with Pastor Rob Haynes on Friday, he shared with me that in the last year, their church had served 43 tons of food to their community, because they serve both a hot meal and they also have a pantry that they give away food to. And so I'm just in agreement. I mean, I'll be brief. I'm in agreement with some other pastors you've heard here that their contribution is absolutely essential. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your service. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you again. Next, we're going to go to JJ Smith.
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair and rest of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a physician, retired. I also have a public health degree, and I'm going to change the direction of the conversation after a brief comment about my own religious faith. And my congregation, in fact, did shut itself down entirely last spring. We are just about to reopen. We had tried some being socially distanced and having a bit of Zoom available to people, and it was working somewhat, but then things got really way too crazy. And I want to speak to the fact that a religious gathering is not at all like going into the grocery store. I did the grocery store shopping for my family because my spouse has heart disease. And I was very cautious, and I went around fairly quickly, going on the one ways and all of that. And when you are in a religious gathering, you may be singing, you may be speaking loudly, shouting, whatever. And I think, it was very reasonable to put restrictions on. And, your previous bill would, in fact, I think, address this. I've listened through this because I wasn't expecting to be this late in the afternoon getting to testify. But, religious gatherings have been a major source of spread. In fact, I very nearly could have gotten infected over a year ago because I was visiting a son in the Bronx when this first broke out in New York through religious gatherings that then disseminated it. And they had an overwhelming number of people getting infected because of that. And I don't recall, because we had already shut ourselves down, ever being told that we needed to shut down. We were told that we needed to limit to 10, I believe it was, at any one time, and to keep masks on. And I think those were reasonable. And I think, there might be some justification in the legal hair splitting of the previous bill that might be good to clarify, since our Superior Court seems to have decided differently than the courts in Maine and some other places. But I don't see the justification for not treating this religious gatherings as seriously as we took nursing homes. When people are together sharing the air, and this is not something that our framers of the Constitution or of the New Hampshire Constitution would have appreciated, because nobody understood that the source of many diseases was contagion through the air. And so I think people need to really think twice about saying, oh, well, there's this religious liberty thing. We're not saying you can't have free exercise of religion. We're saying you need to respect the need not to spread through close gatherings of people sharing their breathing, vocalizing, and putting more virus into the air. And this is an infection that can spread from asymptomatic people and then go into the community. We see this happening over and over for various reasons, from congregate living and places where people gather, whether it be a bar, whether it be a religious gathering, or whether it's because you're in prison and you can't go anywhere else. And then, the guards take it out of the prisons into their communities. And it's not something where we should treat it as we're being anti-religious. I am a religious person. I love my religious community. This has been a hard year. We're going to be so thankful to be back together. But I don't think this law is necessary. I think that it could have some problems. I don't know that I understand the ACLU analysis, but I would take it potentially seriously. And I noted the ACLU did not testify against the previous bill, which the right of assembly, I think, is a religious right or a right to just a political assembly. And those things should not be overly burdened. I agree with that. Governments around the world, in fact, have used COVID to do just that, to overly burden political assembly. And so I appreciate that argument, but I think this bill is misguided. And I'd take any questions you want to give me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Are there any questions for Dr. Smith from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Next, we're going to Matthew Marable.
Matthew, if you could virtually raise your hand. I do not see Matthew.
Okay, we'll move on to Kevin Twombly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. My name is Kevin Twombly, and I'm a pastor at Restoration Foursquare Church right here in beautiful Concord, New Hampshire. I'm testifying in support of HB 542. Throughout this last year, during the stay-at-home orders, we continued to serve our local community here in the near-south neighborhood of Concord. We cook meals and serve them to people in need. We have a commercial-grade kitchen in the church building that we have licensed for food service through the city of Concord. Many were and continue to be desperate for nutritious food, and we remained faithful to serve hundreds of families each month. And just to note, no one was discriminated against based upon their race, ethnicity, or gender. We serve all who are in need of help. We had volunteers that would go to grocery stores and do the shopping and provide delivery service for people who were at greater risk of infection. While I led our congregation to honor the authority of the state's stay-at-home orders and respect what was being asked of us, we often had to loosely interpret guidelines in order to care for the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of those in our congregation, as well as others whom we strive to care for that are overlooked by other agencies that adhered to a digital-only context. I think we can all agree that digital only isolates and further exacerbates issues of loneliness, depression, and those struggling with substance misuse. We made personal phone calls to every member of our congregation weekly to connect, encourage, pray for, and determine what needs they may have had that we could help facilitate. When guidelines for reopening began being implemented, the church was sidelined in much of that timing. Guidelines were presented for drive-in theaters, for which I believe there are only 3 in the entire state. We looked to those guidelines and answered the call of the people to begin a parking lot service so that our congregation could actually be with one another, even if they were spaced apart by 10-foot boundaries. Presence matters. And as much as we tried to accommodate being present in a digital manner, it did not equate to what that time of encouragement served to do for hundreds of people last May and June. In July, we re-entered our physical building for services. We followed the guidelines and protocols, sanitized spaces regularly, and have had no spread, 0 transmissions occur over these last 10 months. Beyond that, we utilize thousands of dollars for benevolent needs to care for the community at large. We supported local shops and restaurants by purchasing and giving away as gifts of encouragement, gift cards to help prop up struggling businesses long before any government stimulus funds were made available. You see, the church is a movement, and it exists to serve, care for, and bless the communities that we reside in. And that's what we did and continue to do today. By attempting to limit and restrict those actions, people in our local communities, the people that you represent, would further suffer and wait for delayed action from government agencies. Protecting free exercise rights is vital for the health of our local congregations and also our community at large. I thank you, and at this time I am available to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Twombly. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Margaret, that is the last person that I have that is signed up. Are there folks in the waiting room that would like to speak?
Yes, we have 4 hands up.
Okay, let's go through them. Get the first one here.
All right, Victoria Gullah is the first.
We've already heard from Ms. Gullah. Is there?
I think that was on the last bill.
Okay, all right, maybe that might be true. Yes, you're right. Okay, let's hear from Ms. Gullah.
Hear me?
Good afternoon again, Ms. Gullah.
Hey. You hear me?
Yes, we can.
I didn't get acknowledged. All right. So I just quickly want to support this bill as well. Cornerstone actually had to go to the governor just a few weeks ago because he was not treating in his little fiefdom there, committee who took over your powers of the legislature, making these so-called laws that aren't laws. They had to go and say, hey, you lifted the occupancies on everybody else, but not the churches. You know, this bill would correct things like that. It would put churches, you know, not just on equal footing, but really this is, again, an unalienable right that the legislature, the judges, You don't have the power to take those away. And again, just because they are enumerated doesn't mean they can be adjusted. This is an essential right. It goes all the way back to Blackstone's rights. What makes liberty? These are things that are completely separate from government, and government is here to protect. And this bill is going to go back and reinforce that. It's going to remind modern day people of New Hampshire that we have a long history of that these are unalienable rights. It cannot be taken away by government. This is a reminder that we're going back to our roots on how we were founded, that these things cannot be changed. Now, I was a history and political science major. I studied the history and politics of tyrannical governments in Europe. That was my major at McGill University in Canada. Communism, despots, any kind of tyrannical leader, the first thing they like to do is close the churches. They like to divide communities by stopping religion. That's how they take over. And you say, oh, well, this isn't happening here now. Well, look what's happening in Canada right now. I sat in a very intro to international politics with Justin Trudeau. He was literally my classmate, sat in the same auditorium as me. And look what he is doing in Canada over the weekend. In Alberta and Calgary, which was supposed to be the province of Canada, the most free, the most like Montana, its neighbor, and they're arresting a pastor for having church, for having services, and they arrested him on the highway in Calgary, right there with a SWAT team. They have all these armed police coming to his church to shut him down. It's completely astounding that this is happening in Canada. You think it can't happen here? It can. This bill is a reminder to the modern day people in New Hampshire that you cannot do this. These are our rights to assemble in church. You cannot take that away. They were arresting and ticketing people for going in their cars in Kentucky for a parking lot service. That this is happening in this country is absolutely despicable. What the ACLU, they should just be ashamed. They shouldn't have that as their name. They don't defend any liberties. They're a black mark. They are a black mark. They are disgusting. They're filthy what they've become. They protect nothing.
Okay.
So that is my, okay, that's fine. Listen, churches, you know what churches do? They boost happiness. They boost community. What is happiness good for? People with the longest lives, they are the happiest people. What does happy do for you? It increases your oxygen. The way you breathe, you have two ways of breathing, and it brings your oxygen to your immune system. What did our Health and Human Services Agency do? Nothing. They didn't tell anyone in New Hampshire how to boost their immunity. They didn't tell anyone to take vitamin D. They didn't tell anyone to get fresh air. They said,
Miss
stay home.
Miss Gullah, I'm
telling you that.
Ms. Gullah, could you please keep your remarks to the bill, please? To
the bell, but I'm just saying that churches are essential and happiness boosts immunity. It's nothing that our hospitals, no information from HHS to even help people. And it's completely essential, and this bill is important to pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gullah. Margaret, can we move on to the next person, please?
All right, we have Mark Warren.
Okay, let's hear from Mr. Warren. Good afternoon, Mr. Warren.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we sure can.
Okay. Well, thank you, Madam Chair and committee. I do support HB 542. And I just wanted to say the importance of prayer and the gathering of houses of worship in prayer. So last week, the governor gave a proclamation. And I just want to read a couple lines of that proclamation and then just speak about the importance of that as it relates to this bill. Prayer is an important part. It says, whereas, this is the declaration for the National Day of Prayer, but whereas prayer is an important part in the lives of many citizens, and in times of uncertainty, people often use prayer as a way to both find strength and courage in themselves and in the world around them. And whereas, in times of prosperity, people often use prayer as a means to give thanks to their good fortune and freedoms. And for many, prayer provides solace as a way to connect spiritually and determine those things that are important to their lives. And then one last part of this, whereas recognizing the love of and the power of God, we unite with fellow citizens to exercise the freedoms we have to gather in prayer and with thankfulness. while seeking guidance, provision, protection, purpose for the benefits of every individual and our state as a whole. So as a pastor of Grace Capital Church in the greater Concord area, we had the privilege of praying when we were closed down. We had an outside barbecue, socially distanced, for people of the community, and we offered to pray, and that was so comforting for them. And in a time of trouble, in a time of distress, there's something about gathering and praying together and for people. And so we went through a time of being closed down. It was very difficult for our people. And then when we reopened, we followed the guidelines, and gratefully too, we didn't have any transmission or any issue in our gatherings. And so I just would say, in support of HB 542, the church is critical. Prayer and those spiritual practices that build and encourage each other are vital to mental health, to spiritual well-being. And so I just want to say thank you so much for considering this bill. And I know from our congregation and from my perspective in serving a community, helping churches stay open and being essential is essential for us. Thank you. I'm willing to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Warren. Are there any questions? Senator French has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir. How long were you shut down for?
We were shut down from, I believe, either the end of March, beginning of April. We reopened up in July.
3 months. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Senator French.
Are there any questions, any further questions for Mr. Warren? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Warren.
You're welcome.
Okay, Margaret, who do we have next?
We have Sean Locke.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Sean Locke. I am an Assistant Attorney General. I am the Director of the Civil Rights Unit at the Attorney General's Office, and I am here to testify on behalf of the Attorney General's Office. To begin with, the Attorney General's Office neither supports nor opposes the statutory changes proposed in HB 542, but instead I appear today to address concerns that the broad definitions in the legislation may have significant unintended consequences. The Attorney General and the Civil Rights Unit recognize the importance of free exercise of religion and respect the importance of churches and ministerial services, as the pastors who have testified today describe. But at the same time, we also work to prevent other protected classes from potential discrimination, as state law and the state constitution guarantee equality of rights under the law. To just kind of give a quick history here of the kind of core of the issue. In 1990, the United States, as others have described, the United States Supreme Court decided Employment Division v. Smith, and it changed the analysis of kind of the free exercise analysis from being one of strict scrutiny to one of where generally applicable laws could be applied against and enforced against those engaging in religious practices. And specifically in that case, it dealt with consumption of peyote by Native American religious practitioners. In response to that, Congress passed the first Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993, which re-implemented strict scrutiny as the standard for addressing and evaluating application of federal law to religious practices. In New Hampshire, we have not yet, or since then, about 20 to 25 states have enacted their own form of Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. In New Hampshire, we have not yet enacted a what's called RFRA statute, but recently, last year in State v. Mack, the New Hampshire Supreme Court rejected the Supreme Court's analysis under Smith and looked to Massachusetts, and also adopted a strict scrutiny balancing test in terms of determining whether or not state action infringes on religious activity. So this is the same test that HB 542 would apply. And if this is the state of law, why do we have concerns? Because the definitions contained in HB 542 go beyond the considerations of MAC or what the federal RFRA statutes protect. The definition of person includes secular associations, partnerships, corporations, estates, trusts, foundations, and other legal entities. And that means regardless of whether these entities are affiliated with or are religious institutions. This definition of person has appeared in proposed RFRAs since around the country since about 2014, 2015, which coincides with decisions like Oberfeld, which legalized same-sex marriage around the country. Recognizing the importance of free exercise and that it warrants significant protection, this broad definition of person is particularly concerning because it would allow secular businesses and secular service providers to cite religious beliefs and evade compliance with the state's anti-discrimination laws, which provide protection from discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodations, and public education. The anti-discrimination laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, ancestry, sexual orientation, gender, disability, familial status, and as of only a few sessions ago, gender identity. Among other things, this broad definition could prevent state and private individuals from enforcing their rights against secular landlords who cite religious beliefs and refuse to rent to unmarried couples or single parents. This has happened in other parts of the country, citing similar laws. Refuse to enforce their rights against secular businesses that refuse to provide services to same-sex couples or even single LGBTQ identifying individuals, or against a secular crisis counselor who refuses to care for transgender individuals seeking support in a crisis. I recognize that the pastors who support this legislation do not wish to promote discrimination, but the danger is present, and the similarities between HB 542 and other legislation that have appeared around the country is concerning. Similar pieces of legislation have been presented or protested by businesses around the country, which prompted in 2014 Jan Brewer in Arizona to veto virtually identical legislation to what is being proposed today. These definitions are identical. They prompted Mike Pence to sign an amendment to Indiana's RFRA that exempted those provisions from being used as exceptions to the state's anti-discrimination laws. And they prompted Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas to reject virtually identical legislation in favor of legislation that's more similar to the federal RFRA, which does not have this broad, expansive definition of person. Currently in Hampshire, RSA 354A-18 exempts houses of worship and religiously affiliated organizations from compliance with the state's anti-discrimination laws. Thus, churches and pastors will not be obligated to provide services or employ individuals if doing so would violate their religious beliefs. HB 542, however, as written, takes this further and would extend that exemption to all individuals and businesses, regardless of whether they are religiously affiliated or purely secular. The concern is that this would undermine the state's ability to prevent discrimination and harm the state's reputation as a welcoming location to live, work, and raise a family. I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Locke. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing Senator Khan has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Locke. I appreciate the presence of the Attorney General's office and Department of Justice here. Just wanting to, you did say that courts in New Hampshire would apply strict scrutiny to cases brought forth relative to religious freedom, right?
Yes, so under MAC, that is the test that they adopted. It's to a more narrow kind of, again, this definition of person is really the core concern, is that it's contained, like the definition here we would construe as being to natural persons trying to exercise their rights. The issue in MAC was the possession of hallucinogenic mushrooms as part of a religious practice. And so similar to Smith, US Supreme Court decision, it was kind of the application of criminal law or the criminalization of things that might be part of a religion's practices.
Yes, thanks for providing your concerns about definition of person. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you again, Mr. Locke. And Margaret, I think we have one more person.
We have 3 more hands now.
Okay, let's hear what they have to say.
Okay, next is Chris Urchel.
Okay, I'll wait till he comes on. Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. Urchel.
Good afternoon, Chairperson.
Thank you for testifying in front of us. We are starting to run late, and so what I'm going to do is from this point on, I'm going to ask everyone to abide by 3 minutes, and please give us testimony that we have not heard. So again, thank you and welcome to the Judiciary Committee.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thanks, members of the committee. My name is Chris Urchel. I'm a New Hampshire licensed attorney. I'm here on behalf of GLAD, GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. We're New England's premier LGBTQ legal advocacy organization. I want to be clear that I have no position on emergency restrictions or even the most favored nation portion of this bill, except today, I just want to say that this bill isn't actually about whether the services provided by a church are essential services. If that's what the legislature would like to address, that would be a very different bill. As to the rest of the bill, I wanted to make just a quick few points. I don't want to assume you have any information that you don't have, but I also don't want to waste your time. So please ask any questions after and I'll go quick, okay? First, this bill would unravel decades of civil rights advances in New Hampshire with respect to the LGBTQ community. And I'm not exaggerating on this point. I want to be clear that legislation like this is frequently applied to override non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. I don't need to tell you that the advancement of LGBTQ rights here in New Hampshire and across the country have been profound. And my written testimony enumerates New Hampshire's leadership in this realm. We must not move backward on this point. I want to clarify something about what Attorney Hyatt from Cornerstone, his testimony. The ACLU changed its position on RFRA bills, not because Christians began to rely on RFRA protections, but because RFRA was for the first time being used to subvert non-discrimination laws. And also the ACLU's position on the Mack decision was misrepresented. As Attorney Locke said, the Mack decision has little to do with this bill because that case was about criminalizing religious exercise, and Mack did not address the religious views of businesses. It involved only government action, and it did not involve exempting anyone from non-discrimination protections. I want to make the point that this bill is extremely broad. On its face, the bill invites discriminatory acts, including firing a transgender woman because she wants to wear a women's uniform at work, or denying wedding-related services to a couple because they are a same-sex couple, or denying essential health care to people because they're LGBTQ, even intentional harassment of LGBTQ students by teachers. These are all real-life examples that have had devastating effects on people's lives. Third, the bill will rip the state's social fabric. We tend to think of non-discrimination laws protecting only marginalized, oppressed minority identities, but there's so much more to it. LGBTQ people are our colleagues, teachers, volunteers, classmates, neighbors, healthcare providers, our family members. And when we ensure equal opportunity to all LGBTQ people, we're strengthening the whole community. Pay close attention to the specter of liability for the state itself. The bill suggests that people and businesses can collect attorney's fees from the state if the state is enforcing non-discrimination laws against them.
Excuse me, Mr. Urchel, we have reached the 3-minute mark.
Okay, one more quick point, which is that LGBTQ people are people of faith, just like anyone else. This bill creates a false division, pitting parts of the community against one another. It's not the first time we've seen this type of division. Other examples include single mothers or interracial couples, but LGBTQ people are at the center of this vortex right now. I'm happy to talk more about the complicated constitutional specifics of the related federal level cases, some of which I briefly referenced, or any other questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Whitley has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony. So because you've been watching these types of laws, and it sounds like this is similar to, this bill is similar to other laws that have passed around the country, can you describe how it has been used to discriminate against the LGBT community?
Yeah, there are examples of it being used, of similar laws being used against LGBTQ people, but also recently, and this is referenced in my written testimony, there was an example in Mississippi, an event space that was a non-religious affiliated event space where a biracial couple and interracial couple approached to host their wedding there, and they were told expressly by the person who worked there that their religious views did not permit them to host a wedding for an interracial couple. You know, there are examples of people relying on it. So I'm sure you're familiar with the recent Bostock decision from the Supreme Court that dealt with whether Title VII protects the rights of transgender and gay people in the workplace. Well, at the Sixth Circuit level, one of the parties had raised a RFRA defense saying, I have the right to not have Title VII enforced against me with respect to my transgender employee because my religious beliefs are such that they don't permit me to respect the gender identity of my employees. Now, that case ended up being resolved against the employer, but for very fact-specific reasons, and it ended up being a huge, lengthy court battle. And so that was all before it got to the Supreme Court, but that's the kind of thing that we see with these bills.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions?
I don't see anyone raising their hands to ask any additional questions. Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon.
Thanks to all of you. I went as fast as I could. I know you're tired.
That's okay. We have your written testimony and we'll make sure that everyone will read it and review it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Margaret, who's next?
We have Louise Spencer.
Okay, let's hear from Ms. Spencer. Good afternoon, Ms. Spencer. At this point, we're going to institute what I call the 3-minute rule. We are over our time, and we want to make sure that everyone who has called in has an opportunity to speak. So if you could just abide by 3 minutes, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I greatly appreciate that, and I appreciate you making sure that everyone who wants to be heard is heard. So thank you very much. My name is Louise Spencer. I'm from Concord, New Hampshire. I was very moved by much of the testimony that I heard today from the pastors and the role that they have played in the epidemic and in meeting the needs of their congregants. And I think that that's something that really is an important thing moving forward to be taking a look at of how to balance those needs when health emergencies come up. And so I'm speaking more specifically in regard to the 546C2, the free exercise of religion portion of this bill. And that's the piece that I am specifically speaking in opposition to. And it's very much in line with the concerns that the prior speaker raised, and also that Attorney Locke raised, and earlier Attorney Bissonnette raised. So I won't repeat all of those different ways that this bill could, in fact, allow businesses or individuals to exempt themselves from generally applicable anti-discrimination laws. But I would point out that, in general, a constitution is a balancing act, and that there are many critically important rights in our constitution. And one of my concerns about this bill is that it seems to elevate one right, the right to practice religion, which is a very valuable and important right, against and above other important rights, and would implicate equal protection. And so seems to me that people have talked about the MAC decision providing quite a strong set of protections for people under New Hampshire law and through our constitution. And so I think, given the pitfalls that we've heard about through this from the second section of the bill, that it would be wise for the committee to remove that section and focus on the issue of how to protect the exercise of religion during a emergency. So with that, that's my testimony, and I hope I made it under 3 minutes.
That's fine. Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions for Ms. Spencer? Okay, seeing, Senator Khan has a question.
I understood you to say C2, remove it, but C1 is where this broad definition of person exists.
Oh, yes, and the broad, yes, it's the broad definition of persons. Thank you very much. It's the combination of C1 and C2, and that the focus really should be on C3 and how to make sure that, the essential nature of religious services can be protected during an epidemic. So thank you very much for clarifying that for me. But yes, I'm very concerned about the broad definition as it was outlined by Attorney Locke.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Spencer? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Spencer.
Thank you.
Margaret, we have one more person.
Yes, Ian Hewitt.
Okay, let's put through Mr. Hewitt again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was so much legal commentary jammed into the last minute, it'd be negligent if I didn't at least attempt to speak to some of the points raised by
Okay, Mr. Hewitt, we are way past our time for this hearing, and I've instituted the 3 minutes again. So if you can compile whatever objections you have or concerns into 3 minutes, that would be terrific. Thank you.
That's no problem at all. I can certainly do that, Madam Chair. One case in particular that was brought up by GLAD involved denying to serve an interracial couple. And while I haven't heard of that particular case, one thing I'm struck by that we didn't hear from GLAD is we didn't hear that that was upheld by a court. I'm sure it was not. I would be shocked if that was upheld by a court. Almost any court would hold that the government does satisfy strict scrutiny in those sorts of cases. So I think that cases like that are a red herring. The MAC decision, as I quoted it earlier, is not limited to only criminal cases. It says clearly the same language we see in this bill. Once you have government burdening religious practice, the burden shifts to the state to show that the government action is necessary to achieve a compelling government interest. That applies to all kinds of laws, not just criminal laws. And there's nothing in MAC cabining the decision to only individual persons as opposed to religious associations. Certainly before 1990, before the Smith decision, the Free Exercise Clause protected associations, and it still protects associations under more recent cases like Hosanna Tabor, other cases where churches and religious entities have free exercise protections. Now, as far as the Department of Justice seems to have surprisingly broad objections to the very idea of substantive free exercise rights. But ultimately, the only real difference that we heard the Department of Justice point to between MAC and our state free exercise clause and this bill is the definition of religion. That the definition of religion, according to them, isn't limited to religious organizations. Now, that could easily be fixed by, in the definition of person, sticking in the word religious before that list. Cornerstone would certainly not object to that. I will tell you, if a secular business tried to appeal to these kinds of protections, these nightmare scenarios of, for example, landlords just kicking out transgender people because they hate transgender people, I think that would be a very weak case under free exercise protections if it's not a religious organization requiring members to live by their religious beliefs. They would probably lose. But if this committee wants to rule out that kind of situation even coming up, it can very easily add in the word religious after the word person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hewitt. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you again. Margaret, that's it?
We have another hand, Zandra Rice Hawkins.
Okay, let's put her through. Good afternoon, Ms. Rice Hawkins. I've implemented the 3-minute rule. We've gone beyond our time, and so please, 3 minutes. Thank you.
And sorry, I thought my hand was still up. Xander Rice Hawkins from Grant State Progress, and a lot of the points I plan to make have been made today. So I just want to echo the testimony of Mr. Urchel in particular. There was one point, though, that I wanted to draw out that hadn't been covered, and that is that under this policy, which would essentially be a license to discriminate against people in New Hampshire. Some of the language in this bill draws heavily from Arizona's Senate Bill 1062, which I think people may be familiar with from a lot of the national media coverage. It was an extremely controversial bill, and it gives us some insight about what New Hampshire's experience would be like if we went down this path. After the passage of that bill in its lower chamber in Arizona, 3 lawmakers regretted their votes for the bill, saying that it was a solution in search of a problem. They joined with a large bipartisan coalition of state and national leaders, along with several corporations and local businesses, to call on Governor Jan Brewer to veto that bill, which she ultimately did, but not before Arizona became known nationally for its attempts to allow businesses and people to openly discriminate against others. That is not a reputation we want for New Hampshire. We are already struggling with things like state and local elected officials encouraging violence against Black Lives Matter activists and spreading anti-Semitic messages. We know that New Hampshire is better than that. We have made so many strides over the last few years to create a more inclusive and welcoming state for all community members. Some of the legislators on this committee have been a part of that important work. Let's not undermine the bipartisan progress that we've made to date by moving backwards with House Bill 542, and we would encourage you to recommend it and expedient to legislate. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Okay, we are through, Margaret.
Robert Clegg has a hand up.
Okay, let's put Mr. Clegg through. Thank you very much, Mr. Clegg. We're under our 3-minute rules, so please, we've gone beyond our time. So if you could observe the 3-minute rule, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As someone who's responsible for some of the things that the governor has taken advantage of, I just wanted to ask you that when you did look at this bill and you did consider any changes, please don't do anything to make it divisive. Please don't add anything about this so-called discrimination. Everybody that lives in New Hampshire is the same group of people, regardless of color or their sexual orientation or anything else. And it really upsets me when we start to look at, let's change our constitutional rights based on this. Please don't. I know most of you on the committee, I know you won't, and please don't be persuaded. I think we need to fix this. I think people have a right to assemble, even during a pandemic. But please, it's not about race. It's about everybody's rights, regardless. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clegg. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you. Are we done, Margaret?
We are done.
Okay, thank you. I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing on House Bill 542. Committee, thank you very much for hanging in there. It's been another long afternoon, but I would just like everyone to know that as of now, we have finished hearing all of the bills that's been assigned to us. We have heard, yeah, I know. We have heard 47 bills over the last month, and that's quite a lot. And I want to thank all of you for all your help in getting to this point, especially Jenny and Margaret, who's been with us from the very beginning, and Mr. Lehman. Let's see if we can get a motion to adjourn, huh?
I thought it was just one long bill. I didn't know there were 47 different ones.
That's okay, Senator French. Jenny?
Sorry, just before we adjourn, I just wanted to make sure we especially recognize Margaret for stepping in. Today's her last day with us since we're done.
Thank
Come
you
back and visit.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for all your help. I can honestly say I don't know how we would have gotten through this without you. So thank you for everything, and for the public who's listening. When the State House opens back up, please take an opportunity to stop into the visiting center, because that's where Margaret actually works.
Yes.
And so again, thank you so much, Margaret, for all your help. We really appreciate it. And we're going to miss seeing you in our hearings. We might because usually where we meet, you're kind of right across the hall. We might have you pop in every once in a while just to say hey to everybody.
Definitely.
Okay, so seeing that we're finished with our business today, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, moved by Senator Whitley, seconded by Senator French. Is there any discussion on
fast.
the adjournment motion? Okay, seeing none, I will call the roll. Senator Whitley,
Yes.
Senator French,
Yes.
Senator Khan,
Yes.
Senator Carson, yes. I would just note for the record that Senator Gannon had to leave. He had to pick up his daughter from school. So seeing that we are now adjourned, thank you all very much again.
Thanks,
and
Sharon.
I look
Great
forward to
job.
seeing all of you on Thursday. Take
Thank you.
care.